Silas Boone didn't knock. He never knocked. The door to Red Hollow's only land registry office swung open so hard it cracked against the wall, and every clerk inside flinched like they'd heard a gunshot. Boone walked in with two men behind him, both armed, neither smiling, and dropped a leather satchel onto the counter with a sound like a body hitting the floor. He looked at the registrar, a thin man named Aldous Perry, who had worked that desk for 19 years, and said exactly 4 words. "File these today. Done." Perry opened the satchel. His hands went still. The documents inside transferred the eastern water rights of Cross Ranch, 3,000 acres of the most productive grazing land in the valley, directly into Boone's name. The signatures looked legitimate. The seals looked official. And Silas Boone was already walking back toward the door, as if the matter was already settled, already buried, already forgotten. "Mr. Boone," Perry said carefully, "Mr. Cross hasn't—" Boone stopped. He didn't turn around fully. Just enough. "Mr. Cross," he said, "is a tired old man with a stranger for a wife and not enough years left to fight anybody. File the papers, Aldous, or I'll find someone who will." He left. The door didn't swing shut behind him. It just hung open, letting the cold October wind roll straight through the office, scattering loose papers across the floor. Perry stood there for a long moment, staring at documents that would strip Gideon Cross of everything he'd spent his life building. Then he picked up his pen. "Mom, if this story already has you angry, good. Because what Evelyn Mercer did next is something nobody in this valley ever expected from a 63-year-old widow who arrived with $18 and a worn carpet bag. Stay with me until the very end, because the ending will surprise you. If you're watching from Houston, Lagos, Manila, London, or anywhere else on this earth, drop your city in the comments right now. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Hit that like button if you believe people are never too old to fight back. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now, because the stories on this channel do not end the way anyone expects. The westbound train was 40 minutes late, which meant Evelyn Mercer had 40 extra minutes to stand on the platform at Red Hollow Station and rehearse what she was going to say to her sister. She had been rehearsing for 3 days. Across Missouri and Kansas and into the deep frontier territories, she had been quietly working out the sentences in her head, arranging them like furniture she wasn't sure would fit through the door. "Margaret, I know I should have written sooner. Margaret, I know you're angry. Margaret, I have nowhere else to go, and I am asking you outright because I am 63 years old, and I am not too proud to ask." She was not comfortable asking. She had never been comfortable asking. 41 years of marriage to a man who believed that self-sufficiency was the only form of dignity worth having had left its mark on her, in ways she hadn't fully measured until the morning she'd stood beside his grave with a handkerchief pressed to her mouth and realized the house behind her belonged to the bank. The farm equipment had already been repossessed, and she had exactly $18 and a sister she hadn't spoken to in 6 years. The platform was busy in that fractured way frontier stations always were. People arriving and departing at the same moment, the air smelling of coal smoke and nervous energy and cheap coffee from the station house. Evelyn stood near the far end of the platform, away from the main crowd, because she had learned years ago that the best way to keep yourself together in public was to find a piece of ground where no one was looking at you directly. She had her carpet bag at her feet. She wore her good gray dress, which was not particularly good anymore, but was the best she owned. Her hair was pulled back tightly, the way she always wore it, and she had her hands folded in front of her in that controlled way that her husband used to call her courthouse posture, the way she held herself when she was determined not to show anything. The train arrived with a shriek of brakes and a billow of steam that rolled across the platform like weather. Passengers poured out. Families collided in the crowd. Children ran. Men hauled trunks. And Evelyn Mercer stood in her spot and watched the doors and the faces and waited for Margaret. She waited through the first rush of passengers. She waited through the second, quieter wave. She waited until the steam had thinned and the crowd had scattered and the platform was nearly empty and the station master was walking back toward his office with his clipboard under his arm. "Excuse me," Evelyn said. He stopped. He was a young man, maybe 30, with a tired face and a mustache that was doing its best. He looked at her the way people look at someone they've already prepared themselves to feel sorry for. "Ma'am, I'm looking for a woman named Margaret Holt. She was supposed to meet me. She lives here in Red Hollow, has for about 12 years, I believe. Margaret Holt. She would be about 58, my height, dark hair going gray. Ma'am." He said it again, and something in his voice stopped her cold. He reached inside his jacket and produced an envelope. It was plain, unsealed, addressed in handwriting that Evelyn recognized as her own sister's. That tight, careful script Margaret had developed in school and never quite let go of. "This came in on the Morning Post," he said. "We were told to give it to a woman arriving on the westbound today. I take it that's you." Evelyn took the envelope. Her hands were steadier than they had any right to be. "Thank you," she said. She walked to the bench at the far end of the platform. She sat down. She looked at her name on the front of the envelope for a long moment, and then she opened it and read what was inside. It was not from Margaret. It was from Margaret's neighbor, a woman named Clara Briggs, written in a different hand and in the careful tone of someone trying to deliver terrible news as gently as possible. Margaret Holt had taken sick with fever 7 weeks ago. She had declined rapidly. She had passed away 9 days before Evelyn's train had even left Missouri. Evelyn read the letter once. Then she folded it, placed it back in the envelope, and sat very still. The last westbound train of the evening let out one long whistle and began to move. The sound rolled across the platform and out into the open country beyond the station yard, and then it was gone. And the silence that replaced it was the particular kind that comes when something irreversible has just happened and the world hasn't figured out how to fill the gap yet. Around her, the last few people on the platform said their goodbyes and drifted away. A woman laughed at something a man said. A child chased a dog across the far edge of the yard. 2 men shook hands at the freight depot and went their separate ways. Evelyn sat on her bench with her carpetbag at her feet and her dead sister's letter in her lap. $18. No home. No family. No plan. She was 63 years old, in a town she had never been to, on a frontier that had no particular reason to care whether she lived or died. And she was absolutely not going to cry on that platform in front of any of the remaining strangers, because she was Evelyn Mercer, and she did not fall apart in public. She had promised herself that years ago, and she intended to keep it. What she did instead was sit up slightly straighter, press her lips together, and begin, quietly, methodically, to think. The freight depot at the western end of the station yard was still active. A wagon had pulled up alongside it, and a man was talking to the freight clerk in the doorway, gesturing at a stack of crates. Evelyn watched them without really seeing them, running through her situation the way she used to run through household accounts, itemizing, assessing, looking for the line where something could be salvaged. She had her skills. That was something. She knew how to manage a household, stretch a dollar, preserve food, handle livestock at a basic level. She could read, write, and do figures without paper. She had spent 4 decades keeping a farm operational under a husband who was better at big visions than at day-to-day execution. Those were real things. Those counted for something. The question was whether they counted for enough, and in what direction she should point them. She could ask at the station house about boarding arrangements. She could look for work, cooking, cleaning, mending. Frontier towns always needed that kind of labor and rarely paid well for it, but it would keep her alive while she figured out the next step. She could write to her husband's brother in Ohio, though they hadn't spoken since the funeral, and she wasn't certain he would respond. She could... "Ma'am?" The voice came from her left. She turned. The man standing a few feet from her bench was not young. That was the first thing she registered. Not old in the defeated way, but old in the way of someone who had lived hard and deliberately and was still standing because they'd made their peace with both. He was perhaps 70, broad-shouldered even now, with the kind of face that weather and work carve into angles over the course of decades. He held a hat in both hands, which she noticed because it was a small gesture of respect that most men his age in this part of the country had stopped bothering with. His boots were dusty. His jacket was plain but well made. He looked like someone who had no interest in appearing important and couldn't help it anyway. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't immediately name. Not pity, not curiosity, something quieter than either. "I saw you get the letter," he said, "from the station master. I wasn't watching on purpose. I was waiting on a freight delivery, and you were..." He stopped, started again. "I noticed you didn't move for a long time afterward." Evelyn regarded him carefully. "I appreciate the concern," she said, in a tone that was polite and also clearly territorial. He accepted that without flinching. "I'm not trying to intrude on your private business." "Good. He turned the hat once in his hands. "I know what it looks like when someone's had the floor taken out from under them. I've sat on that bench myself. Something shifted slightly in Evelyn's posture, though she didn't intend it to. Were you waiting for someone too? No, I was collecting freight, but I sat there for an hour after my wife died 12 years ago. The station master finally came out and asked me if I needed anything, and I told him I needed her back, and he was kind enough not to say anything to that. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. I'm sorry for your loss. I'm sorry for yours. He said it simply, without performance. Do you have somewhere to go tonight? People waiting for you here? She considered lying. It would have been easier in some ways, but she was tired and the night was coming on. And there was something about this particular man, the way he was standing, the way he'd spoken about his wife without dressing it up, that made the ordinary social deceit feel like more effort than it was worth. No, she said. I came to stay with my sister. She passed away recently. I didn't know until just now. He nodded. So you're stranded. I prefer to think of it as reassessing my options. Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile, but it's relative. That's a good way to put it. He stood there for another moment, and she could see him making some kind of decision. She watched him make it without trying to hurry him in any direction. My name is Gideon Cross, he said. I own the Cross Ranch, Eastern Valley, about 8 miles out. It's the biggest spread in this part of the territory. Not that that means anything in particular right now. He paused. I have a house that's too large for one person and a household that could use someone who knows how to run one. I've been managing on my own for 12 years, and I'm not managing well. Evelyn looked at him steadily. Mr. Cross. I know how this sounds, he said. I'm not certain you do. I'm asking if you'd be willing to consider… He stopped, started over. I'm not a man who does things halfway, ma'am. I'm not looking for a housekeeper, though I need one desperately. What I'm asking is… He looked at her directly, the way people rarely did with strangers. Do you need a home and a husband? The question landed on the platform between them like something solid. Evelyn did not speak immediately. She looked at this man, this weathered, plain-spoken, hat-holding stranger, and she ran the same kind of methodical assessment she'd been running since she opened the letter. She had nothing. He was offering something. He was not doing it with the slick ease of a man running a scheme. He was doing it with the halting difficulty of a man who had thought about it too long and then said it before he lost his nerve. You don't know anything about me, she said finally. No, he agreed. I know you've had a very bad day and you're still sitting upright. That tells me something. That's not much to build a marriage on. No, he said again. It isn't. She looked down at her carpet bag, then back at him. Why? He thought about it for a second, and she respected that he didn't answer immediately. Because the house is quiet in a way that stopped being peaceful a long time ago, he said. And because you remind me of someone who knows how to make a place function. And because… He paused. Because it seemed wrong to walk past you and pretend I hadn't noticed. Evelyn was quiet for a long time. The station yard was nearly dark now, the last light going orange and thin at the edge of the sky. Somewhere down the line, a dog was barking. The freight clerk had gone inside. Mr. Cross, she said at last, I will need at least one night to think about this. Of course. And I would need to stay somewhere in town tonight that is not your ranch. Mrs. Alderton runs a decent boarding house 2 streets over. I'll pay for the room. She opened her mouth to object, and he held up one hand. Not as an obligation, he said, just as the practical thing. You can tell me no in the morning and keep the $1. She looked at him for another long moment. Then she picked up her carpet bag, stood up from the bench, and straightened her spine. Which direction? She said. He pointed. They walked out of the station yard into the darkening town. 2 strangers moving in the same direction, and Evelyn Mercer pressed her dead sister's letter flat against the inside of her palm and thought, very precisely, about what it would mean to say yes. Mrs. Alderton's boarding house was clean, which was the important thing. The room was small, a bed, a washstand, a single window that looked out over the back alley, but the sheets were fresh, and the lamp worked, and there was a basin of warm water waiting when Evelyn arrived, which told her Mrs. Alderton was the kind of woman who anticipated what people needed before they had to ask. Evelyn appreciated that more than she could easily say. Gideon Cross had walked her to the door, spoken briefly with Mrs. Alderton in the hallway. in a low voice that Evelyn couldn't fully hear but that seemed to involve the words guest and please see to it. And then he had turned back to Evelyn, replaced his hat, and said, "I'll be at the station freight office at 9 tomorrow morning. You don't have to come. But if you do, I'll have coffee." Then he'd left. No pressure, no additional argument, just the facts of the offer, left on the table for her to do with as she chose. She sat on the edge of the bed for a while and thought. She thought about what she knew about Gideon Cross, which was his name, his ranch, the fact that he had lost his wife 12 years ago and hadn't remarried, and the way he'd stood there turning his hat in his hands. She thought about what she didn't know, which was everything else: his character, his temper, his finances, whether the ranch was actually solvent or a beautiful-sounding ruin, whether his hands respected him or feared him, whether he drank. She thought about her $18 and the morning she'd stood at her husband's grave. She thought about her sister. After a while, she stopped thinking about all of it and simply got ready for bed, because exhaustion had its own logic, and there was no use reasoning past the point where the body had simply stopped. She slept better than she expected. In the morning, she washed her face, dressed in the same gray dress, ate the modest breakfast Mrs. Alderton put out for boarders, and sat at the small table in the dining room for 20 minutes after the other guests had left, working through what she was going to say. At 10 minutes to 9, she picked up her carpetbag and walked to the freight office. Gideon Cross was there, as promised. So was the coffee, 2 tin cups, both steaming, sitting on the edge of the freight counter because there was nowhere else to put them. He looked exactly as he had the night before, minus the freight wagon. He looked at her, and he didn't try to read anything into the fact that she'd come, or project any kind of triumph onto his face. He just handed her a cup. She took it. "I have questions," she said. "I figured you would." "Is the ranch solvent?" He blinked. "Yes." "How many hands?" 7 regular, 2 seasonal. "What happened to the household management after your wife died?" He let out a short breath that was somewhere between a laugh and an admission. "I handled it badly." "How badly?" "The East Pasture records haven't been properly maintained in 4 years. The pantry organization is—" He paused. "There isn't one." "And the finances?" "The ranch makes money. The household spending is—" He paused again. "Unmonitored." Evelyn drank her coffee. It was strong and slightly bitter and exactly what she needed. "What would you expect of me?" "To run the household. To be treated with respect and to give it in return. To—" He seemed to be choosing his words carefully. "To be present. In the house. That sounds like a small thing, and it isn't. I'm 63 old, Mr. Cross. I'm 70. I have no money, no references, and no family left in this territory. I'm not hiring a servant," he said. "I'm asking for a partner." She looked at him over the rim of her cup. "Those are very different things." "Yes," he said. "They are." She set the cup down on the counter. She looked out the open freight office door at the main street of Red Hollow, which was already moving in that practical, unsentimental frontier way. Wagons, horses, women with baskets, men with errands, the machinery of a working town grinding through another ordinary morning. "I want a written agreement," she said, "not because I distrust you, because I learned from 41 years of marriage that verbal understandings are only as good as the memory of the person who made them, and memories get selective under pressure." He looked at her steadily. "That's fair." "I want separate sleeping arrangements initially, until we know each other well enough for that to change, if it changes." "Agreed." "I want to be introduced to your hands as your wife, not your housekeeper. Whatever my role is in that house, I won't be in an ambiguous position." "That was already my intention." She picked up her carpetbag. "Then I'll need a day to collect myself. Can the wagon come tomorrow morning?" "I'll have it here by 8. She nodded. She started toward the door, then stopped. "Mr. Cross?" "Ma'am." "If you're doing this because you feel sorry for me—" She said it without heat, just clearly. "Tell me now. Because pity is not our foundation, and I've had enough charity in my life to know that it sours before the season's out." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'm doing it because I haven't moved that fast on a decision in 15 years. And the only other time I moved that fast was when I asked my first wife to marry me. I'm not certain what that means, but it isn't pity." Evelyn looked at him for another moment. Then she nodded, once, and walked out into the street. She spent the rest of that day doing the practical things. She bought a second dress at the dry goods store with 4 of her dollars because she was not going to arrive at a ranch as someone's wife with only one outfit. She introduced herself to Mrs. Alderton properly and asked about the town, who was reliable, who wasn't, what the community was like, where the tensions were. Because Evelyn Mercer had lived long enough to know that a town's character was the water everything else grew in. Mrs. Alderton was a forthcoming woman with a sharp memory and a clear sense of who she trusted. She told Evelyn that Gideon Cross had owned the Cross Ranch for 35 years, that he was known in the valley as hard-working, honest, and stubborn as weather, that his first wife, a woman named Ruth, had been well-liked and her death had been a loss the community still felt at the edges, that Gideon had managed the ranch alone since then, declining company with the consistency of a man who had made a decision about loneliness and was committed to it. Until now, apparently, Mrs. Alderton said, with the particular tone of someone who found this interesting rather than scandalous. Apparently, Evelyn agreed. He's a good man, Mrs. Alderton said. Not perfect, stubborn, like I said, and he doesn't always ask for help when he should, but good. What about enemies? Mrs. Alderton paused over her coffee cup. There's Silas Boone, she said after a moment. Who is he? He owns the Boone cattle operation, south side of the valley. He's been trying to acquire land in the eastern valley for years. Gideon's eastern grazing land is the piece he wants most. The water rights are better than anything Boone has. She set her cup down. Boone is not a man who takes no for an answer. He just waits and tries different methods. Evelyn filed this information in the same careful place she filed household accounts. Cataloged, accessible, not forgotten. What kind of methods? Mrs. Alderton looked at her in a way that suggested she was revising her initial impression upward. Legal ones, mostly, so far. He's had surveyors out twice. There have been disputes about boundary markers. Last spring, one of Gideon's water lines got damaged. Could have been weather. But probably wasn't. That's what most people think, Mrs. Alderton said. But nobody could prove anything. Evelyn nodded. She finished her coffee, thanked Mrs. Alderton for her candor, and went upstairs to her room to pack her second dress alongside her first, and sit for a while with her hands folded in her lap, and think about the particular nature of the situation she was walking into. She was walking into a ranch that needed managing. She was walking into a marriage that was built on practicality and a moment of unexpected impulse from a lonely man. She was walking into a valley where someone powerful was already watching for weakness. She was 63 years old with $18 and a worn carpet bag. None of this was what she had planned. None of it was comfortable or simple or safe. She thought of the way Gideon Cross had said, because it seemed wrong to walk past you and pretend I hadn't noticed. She thought of her sister's letter, still folded in her pocket. She thought of 41 years of a marriage that had been hard and often thankless, and had ended with nothing but a grave and a debt. And then she thought, all right, one more morning, see what it looks like in the light. The wagon came at 8, as promised. Gideon Cross drove it himself, which she noticed. Not a hand, not a hired man. Him. She came out of Mrs. Alderton's with her carpet bag before he'd fully stopped the wagon because she'd been watching from the window and she didn't want to make him wait. He climbed down and took the bag from her before she could object, and she let him, because it wasn't a battle worth having and because there was something in the gesture that was simply decent. He helped her up to the seat. He went around to the other side and climbed up. He clicked to the horses and the wagon moved. For the first half mile, neither of them said anything, which Evelyn found more comfortable than she expected. She watched Red Hollow recede behind them and the valley open up ahead, broad, golden brown in the October light, the hills rising in the middle distance with timber on the upper slopes. The east boundary is that ridge, Gideon said, pointing. The line comes down through the draw and follows the creek. That's where the water rights question sits. Mrs. Alderton mentioned Silas Boone, Evelyn said. Gideon's jaw tightened slightly. She's not wrong to mention him. What does he want specifically? The creek. If he controls the water, he controls who grazes in the eastern valley. My cattle, my neighbor's cattle, everybody east of the ridge is dependent on that water source. And he's been trying to acquire your land outright? He's made offers. I've declined. Gideon paused. His last offer was about a year ago. He's been quiet since then, which usually means he's thinking of a different approach. Evelyn looked at the ridge, at the draw running down from it toward the valley floor. at the thin, bright line of the creek catching morning light at the edge of the trees. "Do you have good records?" she asked. "Survey maps, title documents, water rights agreements?" He glanced at her sideways. "Somewhere. The records are not what you'd call organized. We'll need to fix that." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You've been in this marriage for approximately 12 hours, and you're already thinking about the land records." "Someone needs to," Evelyn said simply. He looked at her again. This time something in his expression was harder to read. Not displeasure, but something surprised and thoughtful. "Yes," he said, "someone does." The wagon rolled on. The ridge grew closer. The creek sparkled below the tree line, clean and cold and very much worth fighting for, and Evelyn Mercer, widow, stranger, newly made wife, sat up straight on the wagon seat and looked at the land she was riding into and thought, with a clarity that surprised her. "All right, now let's see what this place is made of. And underneath that, quieter, and what I'm still made of." The Cross Ranch came into view around the last curve of the track. A solid house, a big barn, fences that ran straight and true. Working land, real land, the kind that bore the marks of someone's lifetime of labor. Gideon Cross drove through the gate of his own ranch and said nothing, but he held the reins a little looser than he had before, and his shoulders had dropped about half an inch from where they'd been when he'd picked her up. Evelyn noticed. She didn't say anything about it. She climbed down from the wagon without waiting for help, picked up her carpet bag, and walked toward the front door of the house that was, as of this morning, also hers. The front door of the Cross Ranch house opened into a hallway that smelled like old leather, wood smoke, and 12 years of a man living alone and not particularly caring about the consequences. Evelyn stood in the doorway for a moment and took it in. The hallway itself was wide enough, with good bones, solid plank flooring, walls that had been whitewashed at some point in the last decade, a row of iron hooks for coats and hats that currently held 3 jackets, a coil of rope, and what appeared to be a broken bridle that someone had hung there with the intention of repairing and then forgotten. A side table near the door held a lamp, a coffee tin, 2 mismatched leather gloves, and a stack of papers that had been sitting long enough to develop a slight lean. She didn't say anything. She just looked. Gideon came in behind her with her carpet bag and stopped when he saw her expression, which she had not entirely managed to keep neutral. "I told you it wasn't organized," he said. "You did," she agreed. "I believed you. I just didn't have a complete picture." He set the bag down. "The kitchen is worse." "Show me the kitchen." It was worse. Not filthy. Gideon Cross was not a man who lived in filth, and his ranch hands had apparently been rotating through some basic maintenance out of respect or self-preservation. But it was the kind of disorder that comes from a person who knows where everything is because he put it there himself and has never had reason to explain the system to anyone else. Tins stacked without labels, dried goods in sacks that had been refolded and tied with different lengths of twine each time. A large iron pot that had clearly been the center of every meal for years, sitting on the stovetop with the comfortable permanence of something that had never been moved to be cleaned underneath. Evelyn opened 3 cabinet doors in sequence. Then she closed them. "All right," she said. "All right meaning you can work with it, or all right meaning you've decided this was a mistake." She turned around. "All right meaning I know what I'm dealing with." She looked at him directly. "Do you have a cellar?" "Yes." "Show me that too." The cellar was actually better, dug deep, well-lined, with a decent supply of preserved goods and root vegetables from the summer. Someone had put real work into the harvest stores, even if the kitchen above was chaos. She filed this information carefully. The ranch produced. The systems above ground had simply dissolved over time without someone to maintain them. When they came back up to the kitchen, she stood in the middle of the room and looked around one more time, doing the kind of mental arithmetic that has nothing to do with numbers. "I'll need a week," she said. "Just the household, not the ranch records yet. I want to understand how this place actually functions before I change anything, because changing the wrong thing first is worse than changing nothing." Gideon was leaning against the doorframe. "Most people would just start reorganizing. Most people make things worse." She looked at him. "Do you have a problem with me asking questions of the hands?" "What kind of questions?" "Practical ones. What's worked? What's broken? What they've been compensating for." She paused. "I'm not interested in their opinions about personal matters." "No," he said, after a moment. I don't have a problem with it. She nodded. Then I'll meet them this morning, if you're willing. He straightened up from the doorframe. I'll call them in. There were 7 of them, regular hands, ranging from a boy of about 17 named Clem, who was the youngest and wore his hat like he was still getting used to it, to a man named Walt Pruitt, who was somewhere past 50 and had the deliberate economy of movement that comes from decades of hard physical work and a body that has learned to conserve. They assembled in the yard outside the barn with the careful, non-committal posture of men who have been told to do something and are reserving judgment about why. Gideon introduced her without ceremony. This is Evelyn Cross, my wife. She'll be running the household from here on. Anything she asks you about ranch operations, you answer straight. A few of them glanced at each other. The youngest one, Clem, looked at Evelyn with the transparent curiosity of someone who hasn't yet learned to hide what he's thinking. Evelyn looked at them in return, calmly, without trying to perform anything. She'd spent enough of her life around working men to know that what they were watching for was whether she was going to be reasonable. That was the only question that mattered to them right now. Not who she was, not where she came from. Could she be dealt with straight, or was she going to be a complication? I'm not going to change things that work, she said. I'm going to learn what works first. If I ask you something, it's because I actually want to know the answer, not because I'm testing you. She paused. If any of you have a problem with that approach, I'd rather know now. Nobody said anything. Walt Pruitt looked at her for a long moment with eyes that were assessing without being hostile, and then he gave a short nod, which she understood to mean, fair enough, let's see. Clem raised his hand slightly. Ma'am, are you going to change what we eat for supper? 2 or 3 of the others looked at him with the expression of people who cannot believe what just came out of someone's mouth. What do you eat for supper currently? Evelyn asked. Mostly beans and salt pork, Clem said. Sometimes just beans. She looked at Gideon. He had the expression of a man who has just been caught out by a 17-year-old. We'll see what the cellar will support, she said, which was not a promise but was clearly enough, because Clem's shoulders dropped about an inch with relief. She dismissed them back to work. As they dispersed, Walt Pruitt walked past her and said, without stopping or making eye contact, "The east fence line has a bad post at the second marker. Been waiting on someone to authorize the repair materials for 3 weeks. I'll look at the supply records today," Evelyn said. He kept walking, but she caught the slight adjustment in his posture, not approval exactly, but the absence of skepticism. That was enough to start with. The first week at Cross Ranch was not graceful. Evelyn had said she needed a week to observe before she changed anything, and she kept that promise to herself even when it was painful. She watched. She asked questions. She followed the daily rhythm of the place without inserting herself into it, taking notes in a small ledger she'd bought at the dry goods store in Red Hollow before she left, writing in her precise small hand, "Water drawn morning and evening, east trough low by midday. Clem responsible for chicken feed but feed bin access awkward. Pantry tin rotation unclear. Lamp oil stored separately from lamp supply for no discernible reason." She also watched Gideon. He was up before dawn every day. He worked until dark with the matter-of-fact relentlessness of someone who has been doing this for so long it no longer occurs to him that he has a choice about it. He ate standing up more often than sitting down. He did not complain about anything. He also did not ask for help with anything, not from the hands and not from her. And she began to understand that this was not pride exactly. It was the habit of a man who had spent 12 years not having anyone to ask. They were awkward with each other in the evenings. That was the honest word for it, awkward. They shared the kitchen for supper and the sitting room afterward for the hour or so before bed, and they were both making an effort to be decent, and neither of them had any clear idea of what the social rules were for 2 strangers who had agreed to be married and were now navigating what that meant in real time. The first 3 nights, the conversation was functional. The weather. The fence repair, which Evelyn had authorized from the supply account on day 1, and which Walt Pruitt had completed by day 2 with the efficiency of a man who had been waiting a long time for the material. The state of the root vegetable stores in the cellar. On the 4th night, Gideon came in from the barn later than usual and sat down at the kitchen table while Evelyn was finishing the supper dishes, and he was quiet in a different way than the quiet that had been between them before. She could hear it without looking. She dried her hands and sat down across from him. "Something happened," she said. It wasn't a question. He looked at the table for a moment. One of Boone's men came through the south fence line this afternoon, claimed he was just riding through. Walt ran him off. But there's no reason for a Boone rider to be on that side of the valley unless he was looking at something. He paused. The south fence line is where my property meets the creek access. If Boone's people are surveying from that angle, he's looking for a different boundary argument, Evelyn said. Gideon looked at her. That's what I think. Where are your survey maps? He was quiet for just a second too long. Gideon, she said. Where are the survey maps? In the study. Organized how? He rubbed the back of his neck with one hand. They're in the study, he said, which told her they were not organized in any meaningful sense. She stood up. Show me. The study was a room off the main hallway that had apparently been serving as a general repository for anything that needed to be put somewhere and hadn't been given a better destination. The desk was functional but buried. The shelves held a mixture of genuine records, catalogs from farm suppliers, 3 years of a ranch almanac, and a collection of miscellaneous correspondence that had been sorted into 2 categories, recent and not recent, distinguished by which pile they were in. The survey maps were rolled in a wooden box under the desk. Evelyn pulled the box out, opened it, and spread the first map on the cleared section of the desk's surface. It was dated 1871. There were 3 more beneath it, 1863, 1878, and one that was undated but appeared to be a working copy with handwritten annotations. These are good, she said, with more relief in her voice than she intended. Ruth kept the records, Gideon said. He was standing in the doorway. When she died, I just kept putting things in here. Evelyn looked at the maps without saying anything for a moment. Then she said carefully, the boundary markers on the 1878 survey, were these ever formally registered with the county? Yes. After the last dispute with Boone's predecessor, I had the county surveyor come out and confirm the markers. It's all in the registry. Do you have a copy? He crossed to the desk, opened the second drawer, and produced a folded document without having to search for it, which told her that whatever the general state of the records, Gideon Cross knew exactly where the things that mattered most were kept. She filed that away too. She unfolded the document. Read it. The county registration was clear and complete. Boundary markers confirmed, water rights attached to the property title, signed by the surveyor and 2 witnesses. This is solid, she said. I know it's solid. Boone knows it's solid too. That's why he keeps looking for a different angle. Evelyn leaned over the map again. Trace the creek line with 1 finger. What's here? She said, pointing to a section of the boundary near the south fence line. Gideon leaned over beside her, close enough that she was briefly, unintentionally aware of the warmth of him. That's the old survey marker, corner post. It's been there since 1863. Is it still standing? He paused. I haven't checked it in a while. She straightened up. We should check it. Evelyn. He said her name with a slight weight on it. It's fine. It's fine until someone replaces it with a different marker 3 feet to the east and files a corrected survey with a cooperative county official, she said, not unkindly. And then it becomes a legal problem instead of a maintenance one. The silence that followed was not hostile. It was the silence of a man recalibrating. I'll ride the south line tomorrow, he said. I'd like to come. He looked at her. Can you ride? I haven't in some years. But yes. He nodded. We leave at first light. The south fence line ran along the edge of the property where the land dropped gently toward the creek bottom, the grass running long and brown in the October cold. The fence posts set at intervals that told a story of the ranch's history, if you knew how to read it, some original, some replaced, some newer than others. Evelyn rode beside Gideon on a steady gray mare named Clara that Walt Pruitt had selected for her with the wordless efficiency of a man who understood horses and women about equally and was not going to make a production of either. She had not ridden in 8 years. Her body remembered less of it than she'd hoped and more than she'd feared. By the time they reached the south marker, her back was making its feelings known, but she wasn't going to say anything about it. The corner post was still standing. That was the first thing. The second thing was what Gideon found when he dismounted and walked to it, fresh boot prints in the soft ground around the base of the post. Multiple sets, from more than one person, recent enough that the edges were still clean. He crouched down and looked at the base of the post without touching it. Then he stood up. They were measuring, he said. You can see where the tape was set. Evelyn had dismounted and was standing beside him. She looked at the prints, then at the post, then along the fence line toward the creek. "They're building a case," she said. "Whatever document Boone files, he needs to show that the current markers are in the wrong place. He needs a counter-survey. He can't get a legitimate one. He doesn't need a legitimate one. He needs one that takes long enough to disprove that it does the damage in the meantime." She looked at Gideon. "Who's the county registrar?" "Man named Aldous Perry. He's been there for years. Good man, I've always thought." Evelyn thought of something Mrs. Alderton had said. Boone is not a man who takes no for an answer. He just waits and tries different methods. "I'd like to meet Perry," she said. "Soon." Gideon looked at her for a moment. "You've been here 6 days." "Yes," she said, "and someone has been on your fence line taking measurements." She looked back at the creek. "How long have you known Boone was coming at you from a different angle?" He was quiet for just a beat. "I suspected, after the waterline damage last spring. But you didn't act on it." "I didn't know what to act on." That was honest. She appreciated honest, even when it was inconvenient. "All right," she said, "we photograph the marker today, or sketch it if you don't have a camera, with the exact measurements noted. We visit Perry this week, and we get the ranch records organized enough that if someone does file something, you can answer it within 48 hours. Gideon stood in the pale October light beside the corner post of his own property and looked at this woman he had known for 6 days, who had arrived with a carpet bag and $18 and was currently telling him how to defend his ranch with the calm precision of someone explaining how to mend a fence. "Evelyn," he said. "Yes." "Why do you care this much? You've been here less than a week. You didn't build this place." She looked at him steadily. "No, but I'm your wife, and someone is trying to take what's yours. That makes it mine too." She paused. "Unless you'd prefer I didn't involve myself." He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he said, "I have a sketchbook in my saddlebag. Ruth used to use it for plant specimens." Evelyn held out her hand. He retrieved it and gave it to her, along with a charcoal pencil, and she crouched beside the corner post and began to sketch the marker, the fence line, and the measurements with the careful accuracy of someone who understood that details were the thing that won arguments. The town of Red Hollow took approximately 10 days to form its full opinion of Evelyn Cross, and the opinion was not simple. The general consensus among the women of the town was divided into 2 factions that had formed within days of her arrival. The first faction, led informally by a woman named Dora Hennessy, who ran the dressmaker's shop and had a talent for being the first person to know anything, believed that Evelyn Mercer had seen an opportunity and taken it, and that whatever her skills, her primary motivation had been the ranch and not the man. The second faction, smaller and less vocal, but including Mrs. Alderton and the wife of the local doctor, thought Dora Hennessy should mind her own business, and that any woman who could arrive in a strange town with $18 and turn it into a functioning marriage in less than 2 weeks deserved some credit rather than a trial. Evelyn was aware of both factions. She was aware of them the way she was aware of the weather. She took note of it, understood what it might affect, and did not spend significant energy trying to change it. What she did spend energy on was the ranch. By the end of the second week, the kitchen was organized. Not in the aesthetic, decorative sense. There were no new curtains, no flowers on the table, nothing that could be called charming, but in the functional sense, where everything had a location and a logic, and the morning meal went from a 20-minute production of finding things to a 10-minute one. Clem, who ate everything put in front of him with the gratitude of someone who had been subsisting on beans, told Walt Pruitt quietly that the new arrangement was a significant improvement. Walt Pruitt said nothing, which was his version of agreement. The east fence repair had cascaded into 3 others once Evelyn had gone through the supply records and identified where the maintenance requests had been stalling. 2 had been waiting on authorization. 1 had been waiting on materials that were already in the storage barn, which nobody had checked before ordering new ones. She found this, mentioned it to Gideon without fanfare, and the repairs were completed by the end of the first week. The study was taking longer. The records were genuinely disorganized, and she didn't want to move anything until she understood where it had come from and why, because the logic of a system, even a failed one, told you things about what had been important and what had been neglected. She was working through it in the evenings, after supper, while Gideon did his account ledgers at the other end of the desk. This was how they began to actually talk to each other. Not about the ranch particularly, about the things that came up when two people were sitting in the same room with work in front of them and no particular reason to perform. He mentioned, offhandedly, that he'd grown up in Ohio before coming west at 22. She said she'd grown up in Virginia and moved west with her husband and left it at that. He told her about the first winter he'd spent on this land, in a one-room structure he'd built himself that let in wind from 3 directions. She told him about the year the creek flooded on their farm in Kansas, and they'd lost the entire corn crop and had to make it through winter on what they'd preserved and what her husband's brother could spare. "That must have been hard," he said. "It was hard every year," she said. "Some years harder." He looked at her sideways. "Were you happy?" She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Sometimes, in pieces. There were good years mixed in." She turned a page in the records she was organizing. "It wasn't a bad life, it just wasn't—" She stopped. "Wasn't what?" She thought about it. "I always felt like I was managing something rather than living it," she said finally. "Does that make sense?" He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "It does." After a while, he said, "Ruth and I, we were happy. I don't say that to make you feel like you're being compared to something. I say it because I know what it felt like, and I know what its absence feels like. And the absence is—" He stopped, started again. "It gets into everything." Evelyn looked at the record she was holding without reading it. "Yes," she said. "It does." They sat in the study for another hour, two people with their separate paperwork and their separate griefs, and the silence between them was different than it had been in the first days, less like two strangers being careful with each other, and more like two people who had just said something real and were giving it room. The visit to the county registrar happened on a Wednesday, 2.5 weeks after Evelyn's arrival. Aldous Perry was a thin man with reading glasses and the careful manner of someone who had spent a long time in a job that required him to be impartial and had worked hard at it. He greeted Gideon with the warmth of long familiarity, and Evelyn with the slightly guarded courtesy of someone who wasn't sure yet what her presence meant. Evelyn put her sketchbook on the counter, opened to the page with the survey marker drawing, and explained what they'd found calmly and without embellishment. Perry looked at the sketch. He looked at it for a longer time than a sketch that simple required. Then he looked up. "Has anyone filed anything with this office recently regarding cross-ranch boundary markers?" Gideon asked. Perry took off his glasses and polished them, which Evelyn recognized as a delaying gesture. "I'm not at liberty to discuss pending filings." The word pending landed on the counter between them like a dropped tool. Gideon's jaw went tight. "Aldous." "I can't discuss pending filings," Perry said again, and something in his voice was doing something careful, something that was almost, not quite, but almost, trying to tell them something without saying it. His eyes moved briefly to Evelyn's sketchbook, then back to Gideon. "What I can say is that if you have documentation of the current marker positions, dated, witnessed, detailed, it would be a good idea to have that on file with this office." Evelyn was already opening her bag. She produced the sketch, the measurements, and the 1878 county survey registration copy that she had made a clean duplicate of the previous evening. "We'd like to file these today," she said, "as a supplementary record to the existing title documentation." Perry looked at the papers. His expression did something complicated. "I'll need to assign a formal case number." "That's fine. It may take a few days to process." "That's also fine," she said, "but I'd like a receipt today confirming the date of submission." Perry looked at her for a moment. His expression had shifted slightly, from guarded courtesy to something more like respect, with a complicated edge to it that suggested he was also slightly relieved. "I'll write one now," he said. Gideon said nothing during this exchange. He stood beside Evelyn and let it happen and watched Perry write out the receipt with the air of a man who is recalculating something. When they were outside and walking back to the wagon, he said, "You knew." "I suspected," she said. "The word pending told me." He couldn't say it outright. "No, but he wanted to." She climbed up to the wagon seat. "Perry is a good man in a difficult position. That's useful." Gideon stood beside the wagon for a moment. "Boone has already filed something." "Yes." "How long do we have?" She thought about the papers in the county office, the sketchbook, the dated receipt in her bag. "Long enough," she said. "If we move." He climbed up beside her and took the reins. The wagon moved out into the main street of Red Hollow, and Evelyn sat straight on the seat beside her husband of 3 weeks and looked at the road ahead with the particular clarity of someone who has just confirmed what they already knew and is deciding what to do about it. Back in the registrar's office, Aldous Perry stood at his window and watched the cross wagon roll out of town. Then he looked down at the file on his desk, the file that had arrived 4 days ago with Silas Boone's name on it and a set of documents that had made Perry's stomach turn the first time he'd read them, and every time since. He put Evelyn's papers on top of Boone's. Then he locked the file drawer, went back to his desk, and sat down heavily and thought about what kind of man he wanted to be when this was over. The supper that evening was quieter than most, and not in a bad way. There was a particular kind of quiet that settles after a day where things have been confirmed that you didn't want confirmed, and the only thing left to do is decide what comes next. And Evelyn and Gideon were both in it, working through their food with the measured pace of people thinking. Clem, who had no instinct for reading a room, said, "This is real good, ma'am. Is that rosemary?" "Yes," Evelyn said. "Where'd you find rosemary?" "South corner of the kitchen garden. Someone planted it years ago and it survived because rosemary is stubborn." "Huh," said Clem, and ate more of it. Walt Pruitt looked at Evelyn across the table with those assessing eyes and said nothing, which by now she understood to mean he had heard something in town and was waiting to see how it settled. After the hands had gone to the bunkhouse and the kitchen had been cleared, Evelyn and Gideon sat at the kitchen table with the ranch record spread between them, and Gideon said, "Tell me what you think Boone filed." "A counter survey," she said, "with a boundary description that moves the creek line onto his side of the property, probably supported by a surveyor's affidavit." "Legitimate surveyor?" "Possibly, or one who was well paid to find results Boone wanted." She looked at the 1878 survey copy. "The legitimate registration is solid, but if his counter-survey is filed first and there's any question about the current marker positions, a judge could order a resurvey while the dispute is pending, and during that period, I can't sell, can't borrow against the land, and if he engineers some additional problem, the ranch becomes vulnerable," she finished. Gideon put his hands flat on the table. He was looking at the survey map with an expression she was learning to read. Not defeat, but the anger that comes before decision, the anger that means enough. "I need to talk to a lawyer," he said. "Yes," she said, "and we need to talk to your neighbors. If Boone controls the eastern water, it's not just your ranch at risk, it's everyone who grazes east of the ridge." He looked at her. "You want to bring the other ranchers into this?" "I want them to bring themselves into it," she said, "because it's in their interest to. But someone needs to explain that to them clearly." Gideon was quiet for a moment. He looked at this woman across his kitchen table, with her notes and her survey copies and her careful, undecorated logic, and he said something that came out more plainly than he probably intended. "Where did you come from?" Evelyn looked up. "Virginia originally, then Kansas." "That's not what I mean." She held his gaze for a moment, then she said simply, "I spent 40 years watching what happened when people didn't pay attention until it was too late. I decided a long time ago to pay attention." He nodded slowly. Outside, the wind came across the valley and moved against the house, and somewhere in the barn. One of the horses shifted and the wood settled around them, and the kitchen was warm in the particular way of a place that has started, slowly and imperfectly, to feel inhabited again. "Tomorrow," Gideon said, "I'll ride to the Heller place and the Morse spread. Tell them what we know." "I'll write it out tonight," Evelyn said. "The key points, so you have it clear." He looked at her for just a second longer than necessary. "Thank you," he said, and it wasn't about the paper. She nodded and picked up her pen, and they sat together at the kitchen table while the wind worked at the windows, and Silas Boone sat somewhere on the south side of the valley believing he had already won, and Evelyn Cross wrote the first draft of the argument that was going to prove him wrong. The Heller place was 6 miles northeast of Cross Ranch, past the second creek crossing and up a rise that gave you a view of the whole eastern valley if the morning was clear enough. Gideon wrote it alone the next day while Evelyn stayed behind to finish the document she'd started the night before. 3 pages of clean, precise language outlining the timeline of Boone's surveying activity, the evidence of the marker inspection, and the implications for every rancher dependent on Eastern Creek access. She finished it before noon. Then she made a second copy and a third, because she had learned from 40 years of practical life that a single copy of an important document was not a document, It was a wish. Gideon came back in the late afternoon with mud on his boots and a look on his face that was not quite what she'd hoped for. "Heller's listening," he said, sitting down at the kitchen table and accepting the coffee she put in front of him without comment. "But he's cautious. He said he's had no direct trouble from Boone and he doesn't want to invite it." "What about Morse?" "Morse wasn't home. His wife said he'd be back by Friday." Evelyn sat down across from him. "What did Heller say exactly?" Gideon turned the coffee cup once in his hands. "He said that Boone has never made a move on his land, and as long as that's the case, he prefers to stay out of disputes that aren't his." "The water rights dispute is his," she said. "He just doesn't see it yet." "I told him that." "And?" "He said he'd think about it." Gideon set the cup down. "Art Heller is a good man. He's also a man who built his ranch by not making enemies, and he's not going to change that posture easily." Evelyn thought for a moment. "Does he have cattle that graze near the creek in summer?" "All of them do." "Does he know that a boundary shift on our property would move the legal creek access point 20 yards east? Does he understand what that means in a dry summer when everyone's cattle need that water?" Gideon paused. "I'm not sure I explained it in those terms." She picked up her pen. "I'll write him a letter. Specific numbers, grazing capacity, water access points, what the shift means per head of cattle per dry season." She looked up. "Sometimes people need to see a thing in terms of their own loss before they can see it at all. That might come across as pressure." "It's information," she said. "What he does with it is his choice." She wrote the letter that evening, 2 pages, clear, without flourish, the kind of writing that treated the reader as someone capable of understanding their own interests. She addressed a similar version to Morse and 2 other ranchers Gideon named, Calloway, who ran sheep on the western ridge and used the creek in spring, and a widow named Bertie Foss who had a small cattle operation north of the Heller place and whom Gideon described as sharp, practical, and not easily intimidated. "She lost her husband 4 years ago," Gideon said. "She's been running the place herself since." "Then she understands what it means to defend something alone," Evelyn said, and sealed Bertie Foss's letter with extra care. The lawyer was a man named James Croft, who practiced out of Millhaven, the county seat, 12 miles west of Red Hollow. Gideon had used him twice before, once for a grazing rights dispute in the early years, once for a contract matter involving a cattle buyer who hadn't honored his agreement. Croft was not a flashy lawyer. He was a careful one, which was what the situation required. They rode to Millhaven together on Thursday, Evelyn with her document copies in the bag on her lap and the survey sketchbook alongside them. Gideon was quieter than usual on the ride, and she understood it. This was his land, his life's work, and there was something deeply uncomfortable about having to take it to a lawyer's office to defend what should never have needed defending. Croft's office was above the hardware store on the main street, up a narrow staircase that creaked under their feet. The office itself was better than the staircase suggested. Bookshelves covering 3 walls, a desk that showed the marks of real use, and Croft himself, a solid man in his late 40s with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and the measured patience of someone who had heard a great many difficult stories without being surprised by them. He read Evelyn's document first, without comment. Then the survey copies. Then the receipt from Perry's office. He took off his glasses entirely and put them on the desk. "The counter survey Boone filed," he said. "Do you know who he used?" "No," Gideon said. "Perry couldn't tell us." "I can find out." Croft leaned back. "If he used a licensed surveyor with a clean record, we're in a slower fight. We contest the methodology. We bring in our own surveyor. It becomes a technical dispute that takes time. If he used someone whose credentials don't hold up," he paused, "that's a different kind of problem for Boone." "What's our strongest position?" Evelyn asked. Croft looked at her. She had the impression he was recalibrating slightly, not dismissively, but with the attention of someone who has just realized the person they're talking to knows more than he assumed. "The 1878 registration is your strongest position," he said. "It's county recorded, witnessed, and uncontested for 17 years. Boone would have to show that the original survey was in error, not just that he has a different one now." He paused. "But the filing of his counter-survey creates a cloud on the title. That's his real weapon, not winning the legal argument, but making the situation uncertain long enough to cause damage." "So he doesn't need to win," Evelyn said. "He needs to stall." "Correct. A title cloud means you can't sell, can't borrow against the property. And if he can create enough uncertainty about the water rights specifically, he can argue for a restraining order on creek access while the matter is pending. That's what he's really after. Gideon's jaw was tight. Can he get one? From Judge Halloran, possibly. Halloran has, Croft chose his words, history with Boone, business history. I won't say more than that. The room was quiet for a moment. What do we need to do, Evelyn said, to make sure this lands in front of a judge who doesn't have that history? Croft looked at her again. You'd need grounds to request a change of venue, or grounds to recuse Halloran. That requires demonstrating a conflict of interest, which requires evidence of the business relationship. What kind of evidence? Property records, financial filings, anything that puts Halloran and Boone's names in the same transaction. He paused. That's not easy information to get. Evelyn thought for a moment. Is it public record? Some of it. Property transfers are public. Partnership filings are public if they were properly registered. He looked at her. You'd need to spend some time in the county records office. I'm good at records offices, she said. Gideon looked at her sideways. Croft looked at her directly. Mrs. Cross, Croft said slowly. When did you arrive in Red Hollow? A month ago, she said. He was quiet for a beat. Then he said to Gideon, I think you married well. Gideon said, I'm beginning to understand that. The county records office in Mill Haven was on the ground floor of the courthouse, staffed by 2 clerks and open until 4 in the afternoon. Evelyn went while Gideon met with Croft alone to go over the formal response filing, and she spent 2.5 hours working through property transfer records and partnership registrations from the past decade. She found what she was looking for in the 3rd year of records, a property transfer from 1882, in which Judge Warren Halloran had sold a parcel of land in the Southern Valley to a holding company called Consolidated Valley Properties. The same holding company appeared in 2 subsequent transactions, both involving land acquisitions in the Eastern Valley. And in a partnership registration from 1883, Consolidated Valley Properties listed its principals, 3 names, one of which was Silas Boone. She copied everything she found carefully in her small, precise hand, noting the document numbers and filing dates. When she came out of the records office into the thin November sunlight, Gideon was waiting on the courthouse steps. Get what you needed? He asked. She held up the papers. Halloran has a financial interest in a holding company that Boone controls. Gideon stared at her. You found that in 2 hours. 2.5. She tucked the papers into her bag. Croft needs to see these today. They went back up the creaking staircase. Croft read the copies without speaking. When he finished, he set them down very carefully on his desk, the way a person sets down something they don't want to disturb. This is enough to file a recusal motion, he said. Will it work? Gideon asked. It should work. Whether it does depends on how quickly Boone figures out what we have and whether he can bury the connection before the motion is heard. Croft looked at Evelyn. How many people know you were in that records office today? The 2 clerks, she said. And now you. The clerks? Did they help you find these specifically? No, I found them myself. They provided the general index. Croft nodded. Then we file quietly and quickly. I want this in front of the circuit judge before Boone's people know we have it. He looked at Gideon. I need the full survey documentation. Originals, not copies, by Monday. You'll have them Saturday, Evelyn said. Croft almost smiled. Saturday, then. Boone was telling them that the legal challenge was one front, and that he was willing to open another one. He was gambling that an elderly rancher with a month-old marriage and a household in recovery would not have the resources to fight on 2 fronts simultaneously. He had miscalculated the household. Evelyn sat down and wrote a letter to Croft that night, detailing the waterline incident, the date, the nature of the cut, and its position on the property relative to the disputed boundary. She added it to the incident log. She also wrote a shorter letter to Mrs. Alderton in Red Hollow, because Mrs. Alderton knew everyone in the valley and information had a way of moving through certain people in useful directions. Gideon came back in after midnight, mud to his knees, the water rerouted and the immediate crisis managed. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the papers on the table and then at Evelyn, who was still sitting there with the lamp burning. You should sleep, he said. Probably. She didn't move. Is the reroute holding? For now. We'll need to repair the main line properly. 2 days of work, maybe 3. I'll add the repair cost to the incident documentation, she said. He came into the kitchen and sat down across from her, still in his work clothes. His face was tired in a way that went past the physical, the kind of tired that comes from fighting something you shouldn't have to fight. I've been on this land for 35 years, he said. It wasn't a complaint exactly. It was just a fact that needed saying. I know, she said. Ruth and I built it from nothing. That first winter, he stopped. I don't talk about that winter much. You don't have to. I know. He looked at the papers on the table. When Boone first started pushing, a few years back, I thought, if I just held my ground and didn't engage, it would pass. That if I was solid enough, he'd find an easier target. Evelyn was quiet, listening. I think I waited too long, he said. Maybe, she said honestly. But you have the documentation now. Croft has the recusal motion. And Boone just gave us another piece of evidence by cutting that line. She paused. He thinks he's applying pressure. He's actually building our case. Gideon looked at her across the table. The lamp was burning low between them, and his face in that light was tired and weathered and completely unguarded in the way that people's faces get when it's past midnight and they're too exhausted to maintain any kind of performance. What would you have done, he said, if I hadn't been there that night at the station? She considered it. Found somewhere to sleep, started looking for work in the morning. You would have been all right. Eventually, she said. Probably. I'm glad I was there. She looked at him for a moment, then she said carefully, So am I. It was not a large thing to say, but the way she said it, without qualification, without any of the careful hedging she usually applied to personal statements, made it larger than the words. He nodded. He got up from the table, said good night, and went down the hall to his room. Evelyn sat for another few minutes, listening to the house settle around her, and then she turned down the lamp and went to bed. The letters to the neighboring ranchers began to produce results in the second week of November. Bertie Foss was the first to respond, arriving at Cross Ranch on a gray Thursday morning on a horse. She rode with the casual authority of someone who had been doing it for 30 years. She was a compact woman in her mid-50s with wind-burned cheeks and eyes that took in the yard and the house, and Evelyn in approximately 4 seconds. "You're the new wife," she said. "I am," Evelyn said. "I heard you reorganized the whole kitchen in a week." "More or less that—" Bertie looked at her for another second. "Good. Gideon's been eating beans for 12 years. She dismounted and tied her horse to the post. "Show me the survey maps." They spent 2 hours at the kitchen table, Bertie and Evelyn and Gideon, going through the documentation. Bertie asked direct questions and got direct answers and didn't waste time on anything decorative. When she'd seen everything, she sat back and said, "If he shifts that boundary and controls the creek access point, my spring grazing is finished. I run 300 head through that corridor in April and May." "I know," Evelyn said. "What do you need from me?" "A signed statement about your historical creek access," Evelyn said. "Dates, head counts, anything you have in your own records that establishes the established access point. If this goes to a circuit judge, I want to show that it's not just Cross Ranch being affected. It's the whole Eastern Valley. That's what the statement should say." Bertie looked at Gideon. "Your wife draws up the statement, or do I need to write it myself?" "She'll draw it up," Gideon said. "You read it and correct anything that's not accurate." Bertie nodded. Then she said to Evelyn, "Heller's coming around. He talked to Callaway, and Callaway told him straight that if Boone controls the water, he'll be selling to Boone inside of 3 years anyway. Heller doesn't like being told things, but he's not stupid." "That's good to hear," Evelyn said. "Morse is a harder case. His wife runs the books and she's scared of Boone." Bertie paused. "Somebody needs to talk to his wife, not to him." Evelyn looked at her. "Would you be willing to do that?" Bertie almost smiled. "Already planning on it." The escalation came in the third week of November, on a night when the temperature dropped below freezing for the first time, and the valley was hard and quiet under a half moon. Evelyn woke at 2 in the morning to the sound of horses outside. Not one or two, but several, moving in from the south. She lay still for a moment and listened, and the count she got from the sounds was at least 4, possibly 5 riders. She got up, put on her shoes and her heavy coat over her nightclothes, and went to the window. She could see them at the edge of the yard, 5 riders, staying back from the house, near the south fence gate. One of them had a lantern. She went into the hall and knocked on Gideon's door. "I hear them," he said, before she'd said anything. He came out dressed, which meant he'd been awake already. He had a rifle. She followed him to the front room. Through the window, the riders had not moved closer to the house, but one of them had dismounted and was doing something at the fence gate. "Walt," Gideon said. He was already at the door. He opened it and called toward the bunkhouse, not loudly, just enough to carry. Walt appeared in the bunkhouse doorway within 30 seconds, which told Evelyn that Walt Pruitt had also been awake. He came across the yard at a walk, not running, not showing alarm, because running in a situation like this told the other people that you were afraid, and Walt had decided long ago not to show that. Gideon stepped onto the porch. "You there," he called toward the fence. "State your business or leave this property." One of the mounted riders moved forward slightly. Evelyn couldn't see his face in the dark, but his voice was flat and practiced. "We're here on behalf of a legal filing regarding boundary access. We have a right to place survey markers per the pending land claim." "You have no right to be on my property at 2 in the morning, Gideon said. "The filing you're referencing is under contest. You place one marker on this land tonight, and I'll have you in front of a judge for trespassing by Friday." "That filing is contested," Evelyn said. She had come to stand beside Gideon on the porch. She had the incident ledger under her arm because she had grabbed it by reflex on the way out, and she was now holding it without entirely meaning to make a point, but she was making one. "Everything your employer files is being documented and countered, including this visit, date, time, number of riders, position on the property." She paused. "I have all of it." There was a pause from the mounted riders, a muttered exchange she couldn't quite hear. "We'll be back in daylight," the flat voice said. "You'll be back with a court order or you won't be on this property at all," Gideon said. Another pause. Then the riders turned and moved back south, the lantern swinging as they went, until the sound of the horses faded and the night was quiet again. Walt stood in the yard looking after them. Clement appeared from the bunkhouse and was standing behind Walt with his hat on crooked and an expression of someone who had been woken up in the middle of something and was not yet sure how serious it was. "Both of you stay on the property tomorrow," Gideon said. "Everyone does." "Yes, sir," Walt said. They went back inside. Evelyn put the incident ledger on the kitchen table and wrote the entry for the night. Date, time, 5 riders, position at South Fence Gate, exchange of words, riders withdrew. She wrote it all while the details were fresh. Gideon stood in the kitchen doorway watching her. "You came outside," he said. "Yes." "It could have been dangerous." "It could have," she agreed, writing. "But the ledger was useful." He was quiet for a moment. "They weren't just there to put up markers," he said. "No." She set down her pen. "They were there to see if you were alone. If you'd come out by yourself in the dark with no one beside you, it would have told them something useful about your position." She paused. "As it is, they saw that the house is staffed, the hands responded quickly, and someone is keeping written records." She picked up the pen again. "That's also useful information. For us." Gideon looked at her for a long moment. Then he crossed the kitchen, pulled out a chair, and sat down across from her. "Evelyn," he said. She looked up. "When this is over," he said, "I would like to take you to supper at the hotel in Millhaven. Not to discuss anything, not to plan anything, just supper." She looked at him. In the lamplight, with the cold outside and the recent quiet of the retreating riders, he looked tired and something else, determined, but also simply present in the way that people are when they've been reminded that things can be taken. "When this is over," she said. "Yes." He nodded. He didn't move to go back to bed, and neither did she. They sat in the kitchen while the night wound down around them, and after a while Gideon made coffee because neither of them was going to sleep anyway, and they sat on opposite sides of the table and talked, quietly, without urgency, about things that had nothing to do with Boone or boundary lines. He told her about the summer of 1874, when the valley had a wildflower bloom so thick it turned the hillsides purple for 6 weeks, and Ruth had made him ride out to see it, even though it wasn't a practical use of an afternoon. She told him about the spring on their Kansas farm, when a pair of red-tailed hawks nested in the oak tree behind the barn, and she had spent 3 weeks watching them without telling her husband, because he would have thought it was wasted time. They talked until the sky outside started to gray, and then they both stood up and got ready for the day. And the kitchen felt different than it had when they'd sat down. Not warmer exactly, but more inhabited, more known. Croft filed the recusal motion on Friday morning. By Friday afternoon, word had reached Boone that Judge Halloran was being removed from the land dispute case on grounds of financial conflict of interest. By Friday evening, according to Mrs. Alderton, who had the information from a reliable source at the county clerk's office, Silas Boone had gone to Halloran's office in person and spent 45 minutes there, and had come out looking like a man who had just been told the one thing he didn't want to hear. Gideon got the news from Croft by letter on Saturday. He read it at the kitchen table and handed it to Evelyn without comment. She read it, set it down. "He's going to escalate again," she said. "I know. He'll try something before the new judge can schedule a hearing. He needs to create a fact on the ground, something that takes time to undo even if we win the legal argument. What can he do?" Evelyn thought through it. Physical disruption to the boundary markers. Another water line cut, or something worse. An attempt to actually put cattle on the disputed land and establish a use claim. He might try to occupy the south pasture, she said. If he runs Boone cattle on Crossland before the hearing, he can argue established use. Gideon's eyes went flat. "He puts cattle on my land. We document it," she said. "Immediately, thoroughly, with witnesses. That's more useful than removing them by force." He looked at her. "I know," she said. "I know it's your land, but a confrontation gives him something to muddy the record with. Documentation gives us something to win with." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'm going to call a meeting." "Who?" "Heller, Bertie, Calloway, whoever else is listening." He looked at the letter. "If Boone puts cattle on my south pasture, I want neighbors who can testify that they witnessed it. That's not a Cross Ranch problem anymore. That's a valley problem." Evelyn looked at him. "Yes," she said. "Exactly." He stood up from the table and put his hat on. "I'll ride to Heller today." She was already reaching for her pen. The meeting happened the following Tuesday, in the barn at Cross Ranch, because the barn was the largest enclosed space, and the weather had turned serious, and nobody wanted to stand in the wind. 7 ranchers came, plus Bertie Foss and the wife of Morse, who had overcome her fear, or at least overridden it enough to be present. And Walt Pruitt stood near the door without being asked, because he was Walt Pruitt, and this was his ranch too, in the way that a place becomes yours when you've given enough years to it. Gideon spoke first, plainly and without performance, laying out what they knew. Then Evelyn spoke, and she was plainer still. Numbers, dates, the nature of the water rights claim, what a successful boundary shift would mean per ranch. She didn't appeal to anyone's sense of community. She just told them the facts and let the facts make the argument. When she finished, Art Heller, who had been a cautious man and came in cautious, said, "If he gets the creek, what's my realistic timeline before I'm buying water access from Boone?" 2 dry summers, Evelyn said. 3 at most. Heller sat with that for a moment. Then he said, "What do you need from us?" And that was the moment. Not dramatic, not decorated, just a man doing the math and arriving at the right answer. When the valley stopped being a collection of separate operations and started being something that could hold together under pressure. Evelyn looked at their faces in the lamplight of the barn, and she thought of how little she had known 6 weeks ago, standing on a station platform with $18 and a dead sister's letter. She thought of Gideon turning his hat in his hands. She thought of the quiet kitchen at 2 in the morning and a man making coffee because neither of them could sleep. She thought, this is what a home is. Not just the house. All of this. She picked up her pen and her ledger and she began once more to write. Boone moved on a Thursday. They had known something was coming. The barn meeting had not been a secret, and Boone had people in Red Hollow who noticed things and reported back. Evelyn had assumed they had perhaps a week before he made his next move. She had been optimistic by 4 days. Walt Pruitt came to the house at first light with the news. 23 head of Boone cattle on the south pasture, driven through a gap in the fence that had been cut clean overnight, with 2 Boone riders sitting their horses at the edge of the property line, like they were waiting to be noticed. Gideon heard it and went very still in the way that certain men go still when they are deciding not to do the thing they most want to do. "Don't go out there angry," Evelyn said. "I'm not angry," he said. "You are," she said, "which is completely reasonable. Go out there anyway, but take Walt and take Clem and tell Clem to bring the sketchbook." He looked at her. Sketches of the cattle, the brand, the position of the gap, the riders, everything, she said. Dated and witnessed. We need it before anything else happens. He went. Evelyn put on her coat and followed at enough distance that she wasn't in the immediate scene, but close enough to watch. She stood at the edge of the yard with the incident ledger and wrote, while Gideon rode to the south pasture with Walt and Clem behind him. The two Boone riders didn't move when Gideon approached. One of them was a man she hadn't seen before, broad, unhurried, the particular posture of someone who has been sent to create a situation and has been told he doesn't need to escalate it himself. "These cattle are on Cross Ranch land," Gideon said. He didn't raise his voice. "You've got 1 hour to move them back through that gap and repair the fence." The rider looked at him without particular concern. "This land is under a boundary dispute. Our employer has a legal claim to use access pending resolution." "Your employer has a filing," Gideon said. "He doesn't have a ruling, and a filing doesn't give him grazing rights on my property. We've been advised otherwise." "Then whoever advised you wrong." Gideon held the man's gaze. "I'm telling you this once, clearly, so there's no confusion later. You are on Cross Ranch land without permission. My hands are documenting the position of your cattle, the breach in the fence, your presence here, and the time. All of it goes to our lawyer today." The rider looked past Gideon to where Clem was sketching, and something shifted slightly in his expression. Not worry exactly, but the recalculation of a man who had expected a different kind of confrontation. "We're not moving the cattle," he said. "That's your choice," Gideon said. "Document it, Clem." He turned his horse and rode back to the house. Evelyn was waiting by the fence. "How many head?" Walt counted 23, 2 riders. "The gap is about 8 feet, cut last night." The rider said they had legal advice that the filing gave them use access? Those were the words. She wrote them down. Verbatim, as best as Gideon could recall. "That's going to matter," she said. "If they're claiming the pending filing justifies occupation, they're overreaching the filing's actual scope. Croft can use that." Gideon looked at the south pasture where Boone's cattle were grazing his grass with the indifferent contentment of animals who had no idea they were the center of a legal strategy. His jaw was still tight. "I want them off my land, Evelyn." "I know," she said, "and they will be. But if you move them by force, Boone has an incident to point to. If we do this right, Boone has 23 head of cattle and 2 witnesses proving he occupied land he had no legal right to occupy." She paused. "That's a much better position for us." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, in a voice that was controlled but only just, "Get Croft on the road today." She was already walking back to the house to write the letter. Croft arrived the following afternoon, having made the 12 miles from Millhaven in better time than the road usually allowed. He read Evelyn's incident letter on the front porch of Cross Ranch while Gideon stood beside him, and when he finished, he folded it with the particular care of a lawyer who has just been handed something useful. "They claim the filing gave them use access?" he said. "Those were the words Gideon reported," Evelyn said, documented within 20 minutes of the conversation. "That's not what the filing claims. The filing disputes the boundary. It doesn't claim occupancy rights during the dispute period." Croft looked at Gideon. "They either misunderstood their own filing or they're gambling that you won't know the difference." "Or Boone told them to say it and see what happened," Evelyn said. Croft looked at her. "That too." He tucked the letter into his case. "I can have a trespass injunction filed by tomorrow morning. The cattle need to come off within 48 hours of service, or Boone is in contempt." "How long for service?" "If the sheriff's office cooperates, 2 days. If they drag their feet—" He paused. "The sheriff in this county has been known to be slow on matters involving Boone." Evelyn had been thinking about this since the morning. Does the sheriff's reluctance have anything to do with the same holding company connection we found for Halloran? Croft stopped. "What makes you ask that?" "Because Boone's network seems to run through official channels consistently. The forged survey gets filed without question. Riders claim legal authority they don't have. That level of confidence usually means more than one cooperative official." She paused. "Sheriff Dunbar's name, is it in any of those partnership records?" Croft looked at her for a long moment. "I don't know," he said. "But that's worth finding out." "I'll go back to the records office," Evelyn said. "Evelyn," Gideon said. She looked at him. "You've been doing this for 6 weeks. You don't have to Someone does," she said simply, and that was the end of that conversation. She went to Mill Haven on Friday with Bertie Foss because Bertie had business at the feed merchant, and because Evelyn had learned in 6 weeks of frontier life that a woman alone in a county records office draws more attention than two women who look like they're there on separate errands. The connection she was looking for took an hour and 20 minutes to find, buried in a set of municipal property records from 1880. Sheriff Dale Dunbar, listed as a co-signatory on a loan secured against property held by Consolidated Valley Properties. The same holding company, the same Boone connection. Not a partnership, a loan. Smaller, more deniable, but present. She copied it and went to find Bertie at the feed merchant. "Got what you needed?" Bertie asked, loading sacks. "Yes," Evelyn said. Bertie looked at her face. "Bad?" "It's what I expected," Evelyn said, "which doesn't make it better." On the ride back to the ranch, Bertie said, "You know this is going to get uglier before it gets better." "Yes." "Boone's going to figure out you're the one pulling this together, not Gideon, you." Evelyn watched the road. "Gideon is the one who built the ranch and held the land for 35 years. I'm just organizing what's already here." "That's modest," Bertie said. "And it's also not wrong, but it's modest." She clicked to her horse. "I'm just saying, watch yourself. Men like Boone don't like being outmaneuvered by anyone. They especially don't like it when the person doing it is a woman who arrived with a carpetbag 6 weeks ago." Evelyn said nothing to that. She filed it in the same careful place she filed everything else. The trespass injunction was served on Saturday. Sheriff Dunbar served it himself, which surprised Croft and surprised Evelyn less. A man with something to hide sometimes performs the expected duty precisely to demonstrate he has nothing to hide. The Boone cattle were moved off the south pasture within the required period, and the fence gap was repaired by Cross Ranch hands on Sunday morning, while Clem complained mildly about the cold, and Walt told him to work faster if he wanted to be warmer. The hearing for the boundary dispute was assigned to Circuit Judge Emmeline Tate, who wrote a 3-county circuit and had a reputation, according to Croft, for short patience with incomplete documentation and long patience with parties who came prepared. She was due in Mill Haven in the 3rd week of December. That gave them 3 weeks. Evelyn used all of them. She organized the ranch record room completely in the first week. Everything dated, cross-referenced, the survey documentation in a separate folder with the county registration, the incident ledger fare copied into a clean version that read as a coherent timeline from the first Boone rider on the fence line to the cattle occupation and trespass injunction. She wrote summaries of each neighboring rancher's historical creek access, incorporating the signed statements Bertie had collected from Heller, Calloway, and Morse's wife. Gideon watched this process with the slightly dazed expression of a man watching someone reorganize a room he'd lived in for years and discovering he can find things now. "You missed this," he said one evening, gesturing at the record room. She looked up from the folder she was annotating. "Missed what?" "This," he gestured again. "Work, real work. Not just maintaining something, but building something." She considered that. "I didn't think of it that way when I was doing it," she said. "On the farm, I was always managing towards survival. This is—" She paused, looking at the organized shelves, the clean folders, the timeline she'd constructed from a month of careful observation. "Yes, this is different. You're good at it." "I'm organized," she said. That's not the same thing. In my experience, organization and effectiveness are closer to the same thing than most people admit." He leaned against the doorframe. "Ruth used to say that chaos is just bad filing." Evelyn smiled. A real one, not the careful, controlled version. "She sounds like someone worth knowing." He looked at her for a moment. "She would have liked you," he said. "That's not a small thing to say." Evelyn looked back at her work. "Thank you," she said quietly. 2 things happened in the 2nd week of December that Evelyn had not anticipated, though she perhaps should have anticipated at least one of them. The first was Dora Hennessy. Dora came into the general store on a Wednesday morning while Evelyn was buying lamp oil and made no attempt to be subtle about her purpose. She was a woman who operated on the principle that social pressure was most effective when applied directly and in public. "Mrs. Cross," she said, in the caring voice of someone who wanted the other people in the store to hear. "I hope you understand that the rest of us have to live in this valley long after your situation settles itself one way or the other." Evelyn set her lamp oil on the counter and turned around. Dora was standing 3 feet away with her basket on her arm and her chin at a particular angle. She was not a cruel woman, exactly. She was a frightened one who had decided that being the person who said the difficult thing first was better than being the person who got surprised by it. Evelyn had known women like her entire life. "My situation," Evelyn said pleasantly. "You've stirred things up considerably. With Boone, with the county officials, with bringing in the other ranchers." Dora paused. "Some people feel that this is Cross Ranch's dispute, and that involving the rest of the valley creates problems for people who had none before." "The creek affects everyone east of the ridge," Evelyn said. "That may be. But it was quiet before you came." Evelyn looked at her steadily. "It was quiet the way it's quiet before a storm moves in," she said without heat. "Boone had been working toward this for years. The fact that he's being contested now doesn't mean the threat was created by the contest." She picked up her lamp oil. "If anyone in the valley would rather not know what's in their interest, they're welcome to look away. I can't make that choice for them." She went to the counter and paid. Behind her, she heard Dora Hennessy say nothing, which was unusual enough for Dora Hennessy to count as a response. On her way out, Mrs. Alderton, who had been at the dry goods section and had heard all of it, caught her eye and gave a small nod that meant, "Well handled." Evelyn nodded back and walked out into the December cold. The second thing was more personal and arrived without warning, the way personal things usually do. On the Thursday night of that second week, after supper had been cleared and the hands were in the bunkhouse and the house had settled into its evening quiet, Gideon came into the kitchen where Evelyn was reviewing the final version of the summary document for Croft, and he sat down and didn't say anything for long enough that she put her pen down and looked at him. "Something happened," she said. "No," he said. "Nothing happened. I just—" He stopped. He put his hands on the table, and she noticed for the first time that his hands were shaking slightly. Not from cold, not from age, but from the particular tremor that comes when a person has been holding something carefully for a long time and has finally set it down. "Gideon, I've been thinking about what you said," he said, "about always managing something rather than living it." He looked at his hands. "I think I've been doing that for 12 years, just keeping the ranch going. Not because I loved it the way I used to, but because stopping felt like—" He paused, like admitting she was really gone. Evelyn was quiet. She did not move to fill the silence. "I don't know what this is," he said, "what we are. I know it started as a practical arrangement. I know you came here because you had nowhere else to go, and I asked because I was—" He stopped again. "Lonely. The word is lonely, and I'm not too proud to say it." He looked at her. "But I need you to know that it isn't that anymore. Not just that. Whatever this is now is more than that." The kitchen was very still. The lamp burned between them. Evelyn looked at the man across the table from her, weathered, honest, slightly terrified of what he'd just said. And she thought of the morning on the south fence line when he'd ridden beside her without complaint. She thought of the coffee at 2 a.m. She thought of the way he'd said Ruth would have liked you with such plainness that it had cost him something. "Gideon," she said, "I came here with nothing and you gave me a house and a purpose, and you never once made me feel like a charity case. You treated me like a partner from the first morning." She paused. "I don't know what this is either, but I know it's real, and I know that's more than I expected to find at 63 years old." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached across the table and put his hand over hers, just briefly, just for a moment. And then he took it back and picked up the summary document she'd been working on and said, "Is this ready for Croft?" "Almost," she said. "Good." He put it down and looked at her again, and something in his face had changed, not dramatically, not in any way she could have pointed to precisely, but lighter, like something that had been locked had simply opened. "The rosemary in the kitchen garden," he said. "Ruth planted it." Evelyn looked at him. "I thought you should know," he said, "since you found it." She thought about that for a moment. "I'll make sure it comes back in the spring," she said. He nodded. He got up, said good night, and went down the hall. And Evelyn sat in the kitchen for a while after he was gone, her hand where his had been, and let herself feel something she hadn't let herself feel in a very long time. Not happiness exactly, because it was more complicated than that, but something close, something that had weight. The hearing before Judge Emmeline Tate was set for December 19th, at the county courthouse in Millhaven. Boone's legal representation was a man named Garrett Wise, who had come in from the territorial capital, expensive, experienced, well-dressed, and carrying the confidence of someone accustomed to making weight of credentials in a room. Croft had met Wise before. He mentioned this to Gideon and Evelyn the evening before the hearing, in the kitchen at Cross Ranch over coffee and the cold remains of supper. "He's good," Croft said. "He'll focus on process, questioning the methodology of the original survey, raising doubt about the 1878 registration, making the case that the physical markers may have shifted over time through natural erosion." "Can he make that case?" Gideon asked. "He can make the argument. Whether he has evidence for it is a different question." Croft looked at Evelyn's documentation. "We have a stronger evidence base than I've had in most disputes of this kind. The incident ledger is particularly solid. The timeline, the witness documentation of the cattle occupation, the record of their riders claiming legal authority they didn't have." He paused. "Judge Tate will appreciate thoroughness." "What about the Halloran connection?" Evelyn asked. "It's in the recusal record. It won't be directly argued tomorrow, but it establishes context for the pattern of behavior. Tate has seen the recusal motion. She knows why Halloran isn't sitting on this." Evelyn looked at the table. "What's Boone's realistic outcome if he loses?" "He loses the counter-survey filing. The boundary is confirmed at the 1878 registration. He has no legal basis for water access claims." Croft paused. "He'll have spent considerable money on lawyers and surveyors and writers and gotten nothing." "And the Dunbar connection?" Croft was quiet for a moment. "That's outside this proceeding, but if someone were to bring it to the attention of the Territorial Oversight Office..." He looked at Evelyn without completing the sentence. "I'll prepare a summary," she said. Gideon looked at her. "You've been preparing summaries for 6 weeks." "I'll prepare one more," she said. The night before the hearing, Evelyn couldn't sleep. She lay in her room listening to the house and the cold outside and went through the documentation in her head the way she'd been going through it for weeks. The survey, the timeline, the neighbor statements, the Halloran connection, the cattle occupation record, checking for gaps, for things she'd missed, for places where Garrett Wise might find a seam to pull. She didn't find one. That didn't mean there wasn't one. It just meant she'd done everything she could. Around 2 in the morning, she got up and went to the kitchen and found Gideon already there, standing at the window with a cup of coffee, looking out at the dark yard. "Can't sleep," she said. "No," he said. "You?" "No." She got a cup and poured from the pot on the stove. It was old coffee, slightly bitter. She drank it anyway. "I keep looking for what we missed." "Did you find anything?" "No." "Then we didn't miss anything." "That's not how it works," she said. "You can always find something in hindsight that..." "Evelyn." He said her name in the way she'd come to recognize, not sharp, not dismissive, but grounding, bringing her back to the room. "We have the registration, we have the timeline. We have 7 neighboring ranchers who've signed statements. We have the occupation record." He paused. "We did the work." She held the cup in both hands and looked at the dark window. "I'm not worried about losing," she said after a moment. "I'm worried about what Boone does if we win." He was quiet for a moment. "He goes home and counts his losses." "Men like Boone don't count their losses," she said. "They look for the next angle." Gideon turned from the window. In the low light of the kitchen, he looked tired and solid and very much himself, not young, not strong the way he'd been at 40, but present in the way of someone who has survived enough to stop performing endurance. "Then we'll deal with the next angle," he said. "The same way we dealt with this one." She looked at him. "It took both of us." "Yes," he said. "It did." They stood in the kitchen for a while longer, drinking the old coffee, not saying much. At some point, Gideon sat down at the table and Evelyn sat across from him, and they talked about the valley in the early years, the way he'd described it once to Ruth, all open land and possibility, and the way it was now, denser and more complicated and also more known. He asked her about Virginia, about what it had looked like, and she told him about the Blue Ridge in October, the particular color of it, which she had not thought about in years and found she remembered clearly. Sometime before dawn, they both went back to their rooms and slept for a few hours. In the morning, they dressed, ate breakfast, and rode to Millhaven. The courthouse in Millhaven was cold in the way of large stone buildings that take all day to warm and most of the morning to be worth sitting in. Evelyn wore her good gray dress. The original one, not the one she'd bought in Red Hollow, because she'd mended it carefully, and it fit properly, and she had worn it on the bench at the station platform when everything was lost, and she saw no reason not to wear it into this room where something might be regained. Gideon sat beside her at the respondent's table with Croft between them, and the documentation laid out in the organized sequence Evelyn had prepared. Across the room, Garrett Wise arranged his own papers with the precise movements of someone who charged by the hour and wanted it to show. Boone was there. Evelyn had not seen him in person before. She'd heard his name for 6 weeks, seen the evidence of his actions, read his name in partnership records and filing documents, but she had not been in the same room with him until now. He was a large man, perhaps 65, with the physical authority of someone who had spent a lifetime being the biggest presence in any room and had arranged his life to maintain that. He sat at the plaintiff's table and looked at Gideon with an expression that was not hostile, exactly, but simply assessing. The look of a man calculating a problem. Then he looked at Evelyn. She met his gaze without flinching, without performing anything, just looked at him the way she looked at things she was trying to understand. She held it for a moment, then looked back at her papers. Boone looked at Croft, then at Evelyn again. Something shifted in his expression, small, controlled, but there. Judge Emmeline Tate entered from the side door and everyone rose, and the hearing began. Tate was a woman in her early 60s with short gray hair and reading glasses that she put on and took off with the efficiency of someone who had no patience for theater. She ran the proceeding without ceremony. Wise presented Boone's counter-survey argument, Croft presented the response, and Tate interrupted both of them several times with precise questions about the documentation. When Croft introduced the incident ledger as supporting evidence, Tate read through the fair copy Evelyn had prepared, turning pages without expression. "Who compiled this?" she asked. "Mrs. Evelyn Cross," Croft said. Tate looked up and looked at Evelyn directly for the first time. "The respondent's wife?" "Yes, Your Honor." Tate looked back at the ledger. She turned 2 more pages. "The cattle occupation entry, 23 head, 2 riders, dated claim of legal access under pending filing. This was documented within 20 minutes of the conversation?" "Within 20 minutes of the respondent's return to the house, Your Honor," Evelyn said. She was not sure whether she was supposed to speak directly and didn't care enough to wait and find out. The conversation with the riders was approximately 30 minutes prior to that. Tate looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "Mr. Wise, your client's riders claimed the pending filing granted occupancy rights during the dispute period. Is that your client's legal position?" Wise shifted slightly. "Your Honor, there may have been a miscommunication. Yes or no, Mr. Wise? Is it your client's position that a pending boundary dispute filing grants occupancy rights to the disputed area during the dispute period?" "No, Your Honor." "Then your client placed 23 head of cattle on the respondent's property without legal basis." She made a note. "Continue." The hearing ran for 3 hours. Wise was skilled. He pressed the erosion argument about the physical markers, raised questions about the continuity of the original 1863 survey, pointed to a gap in the witness chain for the 1878 registration. It was thorough and well prepared, and he made the case as well as it could be made. But the case itself was not good, and the documentation on the other side was very thorough. When Tate called a brief recess before ruling, Boone leaned over to say something to Wise, and Evelyn watched him do it without appearing to watch. She saw Wise listen and then respond with a slight shake of his head that told her everything she needed to know about what Wise was telling his client. Gideon was looking at the window. She touched his arm briefly, just a moment, and he looked at her and she gave a small nod that meant, "We're all right." He breathed out slowly and nodded back. Tate returned and delivered her ruling from the bench, which was not common practice, but which, Croft told them later, was her way of signaling that she considered the matter sufficiently clear to not require written deliberation. The 1878 boundary registration was confirmed. The counter-survey was dismissed for failure to establish error in the original survey methodology. The cattle occupation was noted as an unlawful encroachment. Costs were awarded to the respondent. The courtroom was not full, but it wasn't empty either. Bertie Foss had come, and Heller, and 2 other ranchers from the Valley meeting. They didn't cheer because this was a courthouse and none of them were that kind of person. But Bertie caught Evelyn's eye from across the room and gave her the same short nod she'd given Walt Pruitt weeks ago when he said something that needed no addition. Boone left the courtroom without speaking to anyone. Wise packed his papers with the professional composure of a man who had lost before and would lose again and had learned to treat it as overhead. At the door, Boone stopped for just a moment, and Evelyn was watching, and he turned and looked directly at her, not at Gideon, at her. And his expression was not what she expected. It wasn't rage, it wasn't threat, it was recognition, the particular look of a man who has finally understood what he was actually dealing with, too late. Then he walked out. Croft shook Gideon's hand. Bertie crossed the room and said, "Supper at my place Sunday. Don't argue." Heller clapped Gideon on the shoulder in the way of men who don't say things directly when they can do them physically, instead. Evelyn stood in the middle of the clearing courtroom with the incident ledger under her arm and the good gray dress on, and let herself feel, for a full 30 seconds, the simple satisfaction of a thing done completely. Then Gideon appeared beside her, hat in his hand, and said, "The hotel dining room, I believe I mentioned supper." "You did," she said. "Tonight seems like the right occasion." She looked at him. He looked back at her, tired, relieved, and looking at her in the particular way she'd first noticed on the station platform 6 weeks ago. The way that had nothing to do with pity and everything to do with paying attention. "Yes," she said. Tonight. They walked out of the courthouse into the December afternoon, into the cold, clear air of the valley that was still theirs. And the work was not over. It was never entirely over. But this particular piece of it was done, and they had done it together, and that was a thing worth a good meal and a quiet evening before whatever came next. The hotel dining room in Millhaven was not fancy. That was the first thing Evelyn noticed, and it relieved her. She had not wanted fancy, had not wanted the kind of place where the occasion felt larger than the people sitting in it. The tablecloths were clean white linen, slightly worn at the edges. The candles were practical, not decorative. The menu was written on a chalkboard behind the counter and offered 4 choices, which was exactly the right number. They sat across from each other at a table near the window, and for the first few minutes neither of them said much because the day had been long and the courthouse had taken something out of both of them in the way that sustained tension does, not dramatically, but steadily, like water wearing at stone. Gideon ordered the beef. Evelyn ordered the same because she had looked at the chalkboard, and it was clearly what the kitchen did well, and she had no patience for ordering the wrong thing out of politeness. The food came. It was good, plain and well prepared, the kind of cooking that doesn't announce itself. "You haven't eaten properly in 3 weeks, Gideon said. "Neither have you. I noticed you at the table last week. You ate about half of what you served yourself." She looked at him. "You were watching." "I live in the same house," he said. She cut a piece of meat and ate it. "I get focused," she said. "When there's a problem I'm working on, I forget to eat properly. My husband used to say I treated meals as interruptions. Was he right?" "During difficult periods, yes." She ate another piece. "It's a bad habit." "One of several, probably," Gideon said, without any edge in it, just observation. She looked up. "You've noticed others? You don't ask for help when you need it. You decide something is your responsibility, and then you carry it without telling anyone it's getting heavy." He looked at his plate. "I recognize it because I do the same thing." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "That's fair," she said. "I'm not criticizing." "I know." She looked at the window, at the dark street outside with the gas lamps burning at intervals along the board sidewalk. "After 41 years of managing everything myself, asking feels like admitting I miscalculated somewhere." "Miscalculated what?" "My own capacity." She paused. "If you ask for help, it means you took on more than you could handle. And I spent most of my marriage being told, not cruelly, just consistently, that what I could handle was less than what I thought." Gideon was still. "Your husband said that?" "Not in those words, in the way things were arranged. What was my responsibility and what was his, and the line between them." She picked up her fork again. "He was not a bad man. He just had a particular idea of what a wife's competence looked like, and it didn't include property records and legal filings. He was wrong about that." "Yes," she said. "He was." They ate in silence for a moment, comfortable silence, the kind that doesn't need filling. "What would he have thought," Gideon said, "about today?" Evelyn thought about that honestly. He would have been proud and slightly unsettled by it. She almost smiled. He was a man who liked to be the one who solved things. So am I, Gideon said. I know, she said. You've been handling it better than he would have. He looked at her. Is that a compliment? It's an observation, she said, which in my experience is more reliable. He almost smiled too, and they finished their meal, and when the coffee came, they sat with it for a long time without any particular agenda, and Evelyn thought this is what it was supposed to feel like. Supper, just supper. Not managing, not planning, just present. The summary she had promised Croft, the one regarding Sheriff Dunbar's financial connection to Consolidated Valley Properties, was delivered to the Territorial Oversight Office in the first week of January, accompanied by a formal letter from Croft and the original documents she had copied from the county records. The response took 3 weeks. When it came in the form of a territorial inspector named Hargrove, who arrived in Millhaven on a Tuesday and spent 4 days in the county records office and the courthouse before calling Croft to a meeting that Evelyn was not invited to but heard about in full detail afterward. Dunbar resigned from the sheriff's position on a Friday afternoon in late January. The official reason given was personal health. Nobody in Red Hollow believed the official reason, but people accepted it with the particular frontier pragmatism that understood some things were resolved quietly because the alternative was a mess that cost everyone more than the resolution was worth. Boone did not come back at them. Not immediately, not with any of the angles Evelyn had anticipated through the winter months. He was still in the valley, his operation still ran on the south side, but the specific aggression toward Cross Ranch had stopped. Croft believed the Dunbar resignation had made Boone understand that the network of accommodating officials he'd been relying on was less secure than he'd thought, and that another aggressive move against Cross Ranch would now be examined more carefully than the previous ones had been. He's not finished, Croft said, in a February meeting that was more relaxed than any of their previous ones had been. But he's recalculating. Let him recalculate, Gideon said. What he needs to understand, Evelyn said, is that the Eastern Valley ranchers aren't isolated anymore. The barn meeting changed the dynamic. If he moves against any one of them now, the others will respond. Croft nodded. That's the strongest protection you have, not the legal ruling, as solid as it is. The fact that the valley is paying attention now. Evelyn thought of Art Heller saying, "What do you need from us?" She thought of Bertie Foss riding in on a gray morning with her no-nonsense face and her immediate focus on the survey maps. She thought of Morse's wife overriding her own fear to sit in the barn and listen. People pay attention when they understand what's at stake for them personally, she said. That doesn't make them selfish. It makes them human. Croft looked at her for a moment. You should have been a lawyer, he said. I would have found it frustrating, she said. Too many things that are true can't be proven. Spring came to the valley in the gradual, unreliable way of frontier springs. A warm week in March followed by snow in early April, then warmth again, then a late frost that took the early garden planting and required Evelyn to start over with the seedlings she'd been bringing along in the kitchen window since February. She did not lose her temper about the frost. She replanted. Clem, who had been watching the kitchen garden with the proprietary interest of someone who had directly benefited from its output, helped her carry the replacement seedlings out on a Saturday morning without being asked, which told her something about how much had shifted in the 5 months since she'd arrived. He said, setting down a tray of seedlings with more care than she expected from a 17-year-old, do you think the rosemary will come back? She looked at the corner of the kitchen garden where the rosemary had died back in the hard frost. The roots were still there, she'd checked. Yes, she said, rosemary's stubborn. You said that before, in the fall. It was true then, too. He crouched down and looked at the bare stems. Mr. Cross said his wife planted it. She did. He was quiet for a moment, pulling a weed without being asked. Do you mind that? That she planted it? Evelyn looked at the corner of the garden. No, she said. I'm glad she planted it. Things worth having don't stop being worth having because someone else valued them first. Clem thought about this with the visible effort of someone doing genuine thinking. That's a good way to put it, he said, and went back to work. She watched him for a moment, this boy who had asked about rosemary and supper and had ridden out in the cold November night when Boone's men came to the fence and hadn't complained once. And she thought about what it meant to belong to a place. Not own it, belong to it. The first real indication that something had shifted permanently in the valley came in April, when Art Heller rode to Cross Ranch to ask Evelyn's advice. Not Gideon's, Evelyn's. He came on a Tuesday, tied his horse at the post, and knocked on the front door, which nobody did. Everyone came to the kitchen door, with the careful formality of a man who wanted to signal that this was a different kind of visit than a neighbor dropping by. She brought him into the kitchen and put coffee on and sat across from him and waited. He had a letter from a land broker in the territorial capital offering to purchase a portion of his eastern grazing land, a piece that, she immediately recognized from his description of the boundaries, sat directly adjacent to the disputed Cross Ranch boundary line. The offer was not from Boone directly. The letter was from a broker named Kelsey, who represented an unnamed client. "What do you think?" Heller said. Evelyn read the letter twice. "The unnamed client is either Boone or someone working with him," she said. "The parcel he's offering to buy is the one that would give him legal access to the creek from your side, even with our boundary confirmed." Heller's face said he'd suspected this but hadn't been certain. "He's trying a different approach." "Yes." She set the letter down. "You're not obligated to decline. It's your land and a fair price might be a fair price regardless of the buyer's intentions." She paused. "But I'd want to know who the unnamed client is before I made any decision." "How do I find that out?" "Croft can request disclosure of the beneficial buyer as a condition of any offer," she said. "It's a standard legal step. If Kelsey refuses to disclose, that tells you something. If the disclosed buyer is Boone, you decide from there." "And if I sell?" She looked at him directly. "Then Boone has a legal foothold adjacent to the creek that he didn't have before, and the valley conversation changes." She paused. "But that's your land, Art, not mine." He sat with it for a moment. "What would you do?" "I'd decline the offer and ask Croft to write the disclosure request," she said. "But I also arrived in this valley with nothing, and I've become more attached to it than I expected. My judgment might not be objective." He almost laughed, the short, surprised sound of a man who had come expecting practical advice and gotten something more honest than he bargained for. "You're more objective than most people I know," he said. "You just don't know it." She wrote him the name of a disclosure clause that Croft could work from. He folded it in his pocket, finished his coffee, and said before he left, "My wife wants to know if you'd come to supper next week. Nothing formal, just supper." Evelyn thought of Dora Hennessy saying you've stirred things up considerably. She thought of Bertie's nod in the courtroom. She thought of the station platform in October, the bench, the letter in her lap. "We'd be glad to," she said. Gideon's health began to trouble him in his second winter on the ranch with Evelyn. It was not sudden. Nothing about it was dramatic or clearly delineated. It was the accumulation of small things, a cough that stayed through February, fatigue that didn't lift with rest, a day in early March when he came in from the south pasture at noon instead of dusk and didn't offer a reason. Evelyn noted all of it without saying anything for 2 weeks, because she knew that naming it too early would make him defensive, and a defensive Gideon Cross was harder to help than a tired one. When she finally spoke, she chose an evening when the supper dishes were done and they were in the sitting room and he was in the chair by the window with a book he hadn't been reading. "I'd like you to see Dr. Marsh," she said. He looked at her over the unread book. "I'm fine." "You came in at noon on Wednesday." "The wind was bad." "The wind was the same as Tuesday, and you stayed out until 5:30. She looked at him. "I'm not alarmed. I'm being practical. You're 72 years old and you've been coughing for 6 weeks, and I would like a doctor to tell me there's nothing to worry about." He looked at the window. "And if there is something to worry about?" "Then we'll know," she said. "And knowing is always better than not knowing." He went to see Dr. Marsh the following Monday. Marsh was a careful man who didn't speculate beyond what he could observe, and what he observed was a chest that had taken the accumulated strain of 7 decades of hard outdoor life and was beginning to register the cost. Not immediately dangerous, not something with a clear timeline, but something that required modification. Less time in the cold, less of the heaviest physical work, more rest than a man like Gideon Cross had ever voluntarily taken in his life. Gideon came back from Marsh's office and sat at the kitchen table and told her what Marsh had said with the flat directness of a man reporting facts he didn't like and wasn't going to pretend otherwise about. Evelyn listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "Walt can take the morning rounds on the south pasture. Clem's ready for more responsibility. He's been ready for months, and you've been giving it to him in pieces. The heavy fence work can wait until spring when we can hire seasonal help." Gideon looked at her. "You'd already thought about this." "I'd been thinking about the ranch management generally," she said. "The adjustments aren't specific to this. The ranch runs better with distributed responsibility anyway. That's just true." He was quiet for a moment. "I don't want to stop working." "I'm not suggesting you stop," she said. "I'm suggesting you stop doing everything." He sat with that. The kitchen was warm, the late winter afternoon gray at the window. "There's a difference," he said finally. "Yes," she said. "There is." He looked at her for a long moment, at this woman who had arrived in his life in October with a carpet bag and had stayed through 6 months of legal battle and hard weather and the grinding practical work of building something together, and he said, in a voice that was quieter than usual, "I'm glad you're here." "I know," she said. "I am too." The adjustments were not graceful. Gideon Cross was not a man who reduced his workload without resistance, and the resistance came in the form of arguments about specific tasks, debates about whether something was actually heavy work or merely looked like it, and one memorable Tuesday when Evelyn came out to the barn to find him doing something with fence posts that Dr. Marsh would have explicitly prohibited, and stood in the doorway without saying anything until he stopped. "I was going to tell you," he said. "Were you?" "After I finished." She looked at the fence posts. "Walt can do that this afternoon. Walt has enough to—" "Gideon." She said his name the way he'd said hers on the south fence line, on cold mornings, on the bench at the station, grounding. "Let Walt do the fence post." He put down the post driver with the expression of a man making a significant concession. "This is very annoying," he said. "I know," she said, "but you're going to do it anyway." He did it anyway. The accommodation between his stubbornness and her practicality was not a smooth process, and it never entirely resolved. There were always things he pushed too far and things she monitored more closely than he was comfortable with. But it was a real accommodation, worked out between two people who knew each other well enough by now to understand where the lines were and why they existed. The ranch ran. That was the core of it. Walt Pruitt stepped into the expanded role with the efficiency of a man who had been prepared for it for years, and was relieved to finally be given it clearly. Clem, who had grown from a boy who asked about Rosemary into a young man who could manage a fence repair crew without supervision, took on the morning rounds with a seriousness that surprised everyone except Evelyn, who had been watching him carefully for months. In the evenings, Gideon and Evelyn sat in the sitting room and talked more than they'd talked in all the months of the legal battle, because there was space now, the crisis having passed, and space was what conversation needed. He told her things he hadn't told anyone in years, about Ruth, about the early years on the ranch, about the son they'd lost in infancy and never spoken of much because the frontier didn't offer much room for sustained grief, and you learned to keep moving. She told him about her daughter, Clara, who had married and moved to Nebraska, and from whom Evelyn received letters every few months, careful, dutiful letters that told her Clara was well and asked after her, and maintained the affectionate distance of a child who had grown into a person with her own life and was not sure how to navigate a mother who had also, improbably, grown into someone new. "Write her back differently," Gideon said, when Evelyn described the correspondence. "I do write back. You write back the same way she writes to you, careful, dutiful." He looked at her. "Write her about the ranch, about the court case, about Bertie Foss and the barn meeting. Tell her what actually happened." Evelyn looked at the letter she'd been composing in her head. She might find it surprising? Good. He picked up his book. Give her something surprising. She wrote the letter that evening. 4 pages, the longest she'd written to Clara in years, covering the train station and the bench and Gideon's question and the 6 weeks of legal preparation and Tate's ruling and Dunbar's resignation and the kitchen garden and the Rosemary coming back in late May. She wrote it the way she would have told it to someone sitting across from her at the kitchen table. Claire's response came 3 weeks later. It was 6 pages. It was the most personal letter her daughter had written to her in 20 years. It asked questions, real ones, not dutiful ones. And at the end it said, "I want to meet him." Is that strange to say? "I want to meet the man who asked you that question on the platform. I think I want to meet who you are now." Evelyn read it twice at the kitchen table. Then she got up and went to find Gideon, who was on the porch in the thin autumn sunlight doing something with a piece of harness he'd told Walt he could repair himself because it was not heavy work, just sitting work. "Clara wants to visit," she said. He looked up. Something moved across his face, not complicated, just warm. "When?" "She didn't say. I'll write back and ask." "Tell her spring," he said. "The valley's worth seeing in the spring." Evelyn stood on the porch for a moment, looking out at the ranch, the barn, the straight fence lines, the south pasture where 23 head of Boone's cattle had stood in the cold and started a chain of events that had ended in a courtroom and a supper and a slow, imperfect building of something she didn't have a clean name for yet. "Spring," she said. Yes. Silas Boone sold his valley operation in the spring of the following year. The sale came without announcement and without explanation. The Boone cattle sign came down from the South Valley gate, and a new family named Harcourt moved into the operation house within the month. Croft heard about it from his Millhaven contacts and wrote Gideon a letter that said simply, "The Boone operation is sold. New owners have no recorded interest in Eastern Valley water rights. I believe you can consider this chapter closed." Gideon read the letter at the breakfast table and handed it to Evelyn without comment. She read it, folded it, set it in the record folder where she kept the relevant correspondence, because she had kept every document, and she was not going to stop now. "Done," Gideon said. "Done," she agreed. Clem, who was eating at the end of the table and had heard the word but not the context, said, "What's done?" "Something that needed to be," Walt said from the doorway, which told her that Walt had also been watching and understanding more than he ever said. He came in and poured his coffee and sat down, and nobody elaborated. And Clem accepted this with the adaptability of a young man who had learned that the adults in this household communicated in a private shorthand that usually became clear eventually. The truth about Silas Boone's departure, which Croft pieced together over the following months from various sources, was that the territorial oversight inquiry begun by Hargrove had widened considerably beyond Dunbar's resignation. The partnership records Evelyn had found in the county records office had turned out to be the visible edge of a much larger arrangement. Boone had been operating a systematic land acquisition scheme across 3 counties, using cooperative officials, manufactured boundary disputes, and financial pressure to force smaller operations to sell. The inquiry had found 4 other affected parties besides Cross Ranch. 2 of them had already sold under pressure before the inquiry began. When Croft told them this, Evelyn sat quietly for a moment. 4 other families, she said. At minimum, Croft said. She thought about the 2 who had already sold, about what it meant to lose land you'd spent your life building, about sitting on a bench with a carpet bag and nowhere to go, and the particular feeling of a floor that has disappeared. "Is there any recourse for them?" she asked. "The inquiry is still open," Croft said. "There may be restitution proceedings. I don't want to overstate the likelihood." She nodded. She didn't say anything else about it, but that evening she wrote a letter to the Territorial Oversight Office, not on behalf of Cross Ranch, but asking about the process for affected parties to be informed of inquiry findings and any available remedies. She sent it with her name on it, not Croft's. It felt like the right thing to do with her own name. Clara came in May, as Gideon had suggested, and the valley was worth seeing. She was a woman of 40, compact like her mother, with her mother's way of taking in a room quickly and deciding what she thought before she said anything. She arrived on a Tuesday morning by wagon from Red Hollow, where she'd stayed the previous night at Mrs. Alderton's, because Evelyn had written to Mrs. Alderton, and Mrs. Alderton had been very kind. And when she climbed down from the wagon at Cross Ranch and looked at the yard and the barn and the house, and then at her mother standing in the doorway, her face did something complicated that she didn't try to control. Evelyn came down the porch steps and they held each other for a moment. Not long. They were not demonstrative women, but real. Then Evelyn stepped back and said, "Come and meet Gideon." He was on the porch. He'd been on the porch since they heard the wagon on the road, which Evelyn had noticed and said nothing about. He stood up when Clara came up the steps and held out his hand and said, "I've been looking forward to meeting you." Clara shook his hand and looked at him, the same direct, assessing look Evelyn gave things she was trying to understand, and said, "She told me about the question you asked her, on the platform." "I expect she told it more charitably than it deserved," Gideon said. "I was a stranger asking something that might have been alarming." She said you turned your hat in your hands, Clara said. She said that was how she knew you were scared. Gideon looked at Evelyn. Did you tell her that? In the letter, Evelyn said. Yes. He looked back at Clara. She's right. I was. Clara nodded as though this confirmed something. Good, she said, and went inside. The week Clara stayed was not without friction. She was her mother's daughter in the sense of having opinions and not being shy about them. And there were 2 evenings where the conversation at the kitchen table got loud enough that Clem, eating at the far end, looked between the 3 adults with the expression of someone calculating exit routes. But none of the friction was the bad kind. It was the friction of people who were genuinely engaging with each other, which is a different thing entirely from conflict, even when it sounds similar from a distance. On her last morning, Clara sat with Evelyn in the kitchen while Gideon was out with Walt and said, "Are you happy?" Evelyn poured the coffee and sat down. She thought about the question with the seriousness it deserved, the way she'd thought about it when Gideon had asked something similar, in the early weeks, and she'd said in pieces sometimes. "Yes," she said. "Not perfectly, not without difficulty." She looked at her cup. "But actually, which I wasn't sure I'd get to say again." Clara was quiet for a moment. "I worried about you," she said. "After Father died. You were so—" She stopped. "You seemed all right in your letters, but your letters always seemed all right." "I know," Evelyn said. "I was managing." "And now?" Evelyn looked out the kitchen window at the yard, the fence lines, the barn, the south pasture visible at the edge of the property, the pale green of the valley in May. She thought of October, the station platform, the worn carpet bag. She thought of $18 and a dead sister's letter and a stranger with his hat in his hands. "Now I'm living it," she said. "There's a difference." Clara reached across the table and put her hand over her mother's the way Gideon had once, briefly, in a late kitchen night. She held it for a moment and then let go and said, "Write me more like that last letter." "I will," Evelyn said. The rosemary came back every spring after that, as Evelyn had predicted it would. Stubborn, fragrant, indifferent to hard winters, and she never replanted it because the original roots held. The valley settled into the particular peace that follows a sustained difficulty, which is different from the peace that precedes one. The Eastern ranchers maintained the loose coalition that the barn meeting had started, not formally, not with any official structure, but in the way that neighbors who have faced something together maintain an awareness of each other that they didn't have before. Heller sold the parcel Kelsey had offered to purchase to a young family named Burke who ran sheep, after Croft's disclosure request had confirmed the unnamed client was indeed a boon intermediary. The Burkes were good neighbors. Their daughter helped Clem fix a fence line in the summer of their 2nd year, and Clem spent a considerable amount of time after that finding reasons to check the shared boundary. Gideon's health was not a solved problem. It was a managed one, which is the honest description of health past 70. Some winters harder than others, some springs easier. A persistent conversation with his own body about what it would and wouldn't do that he conducted with varying degrees of grace. He stopped the morning rounds entirely by the 3rd winter, which cost him something, and accepted it, which cost him something else. Evelyn watched this without trying to make it easier than it was. Some things aren't easier. You just do them. What she could do, she did. She kept the house running with the same unglamorous competence she'd brought to it from the beginning. She kept the records organized and current. The ranch accounts, the property documentation, the incident log she'd never entirely stopped adding to, because a property that had been targeted once was worth documenting carefully forever. She expanded the kitchen garden beyond the rosemary corner to include things she'd been thinking about since the 2nd spring. Medicinal herbs, a larger variety of vegetables, a section of the south wall where she tried, with mixed success, to grow something that reminded her of Virginia. She found, as the years moved through their seasons, that she had stopped thinking of herself as someone who had arrived with nothing. Not because the arrival wasn't what it was. It had been exactly what it was, desperate and uncertain and built on a stranger's impulse and her own stubborn refusal to break down in public. But because the thing she had built from that arrival had become its own fact, solid enough to stand on, real enough to be what it was rather than what it had started as. She thought about this sometimes in the evenings, about the nature of beginnings and what it means to begin something at 63. The world has a way of suggesting, not cruelly but consistently, that certain kinds of beginnings belong to certain stages of life, and that the later stages are for consolidation, for drawing down, for the management of what has already been built rather than the construction of something new. She had believed this, or something like it, more than she'd realized until the morning she'd stood at her husband's grave and understood that everything she'd thought was solid had turned to nothing. What she knew now, not as a lesson, not as a comfort, but as a plain fact she had lived into from the inside, was that the assessment had been wrong. Not romantically wrong, not in the way of stories that insist on happy endings regardless of the evidence. Just factually wrong. The capacity to build something real does not expire on any particular birthday. It requires honesty and work and the willingness to stay in the room when the room gets uncomfortable, and those things are not the exclusive property of the young. They are, if anything, more available to people who have already lost enough to know what matters. Gideon died in the winter of their 8th year together. Not suddenly. The chest that had been managed for 6 years finally reached the limit of what management could do. And the decline was gradual enough that they had time, which was the only mercy that kind of ending offers. He spent the last weeks in the house, in the room they had been sharing for years by then, with the window that looked toward the eastern ridge and the creek bottom and the south pasture where 23 head of Boone's cattle had once stood in the cold morning and started everything. Evelyn was with him. She was with him in the practical way she'd always been present, managing the room, managing his comfort, managing the hands and the household without making the management visible. And also in the other way, the one she'd been less practiced at when she arrived and had learned here, in this house, over 8 years. Simply staying. Sitting beside him in the evenings without needing to do anything but be in the same room. He told her, near the end, that the best decision he'd ever made was the one he'd made at the freight depot while watching a woman sit motionless on a bench long after everyone else had gone. He said it with the plainness of a man who had run out of energy for anything but the true thing. She told him that the best decision she'd ever made was coming to the freight office at 10 minutes to 9 with her carpet bag. She meant it. He left her the ranch outright, which she had not expected and which surprised Croft when he read the will, though not as much as it would have surprised him 8 years earlier. By then, Croft had seen enough of what Evelyn Cross was that the designation felt accurate rather than generous. She stayed. There was no question in her mind about staying, not from duty, not from lack of other options, but because this was hers. Not because Gideon had given it to her, because she had given herself to it. From the first morning she'd walked through the front door and looked at the hallway with the broken bridle on the hook and the leaning stack of papers, and decided to understand it before she changed it. Walt Pruitt stayed. He was past 60 by then, and the work had slowed in the way work slows when the body and the decades reach an agreement, but he was there every morning with his coffee and his economy of movement and his habit of saying the true thing without elaboration. Clem had become a young man of 25 with his own ideas about ranch management, some of which were good and some of which needed refinement, and Evelyn told him which was which in the same direct way she'd told everyone everything for 8 years. Bertie Foss came the week after the funeral and brought food, which was the frontier way of saying what couldn't be said, and sat at the kitchen table and didn't try to make it easier or faster or more resolved than it was. They sat together for 2 hours and talked about practical things, the spring calving schedule, the fence repair that would need doing on the east line, a new family in the valley who might need some help getting established. And at the end, Bertie said, "You're going to be all right." "I know," Evelyn said. "I just need some time to remember what that looks like." "Take it," Bertie said. "The ranch will still be here." It was gone. The thing about the question, do you need a home and a husband, is that it contained more than it appeared to. Evelyn had thought about this on and off for 8 years, and she thought about it still. On the surface, it was practical. A man with a house too large for one person and a woman with nowhere to go. An arrangement that made sense in the bare material terms of frontier survival. And that was real. The practicality was real, and she had never been the kind of person who needed to romanticize reality to make it bearable. But the question was also something else. It was a man who had sat on the same bench in the same grief and chosen, when he saw someone else sitting there, not to walk past. It was not rescue. He hadn't rescued her, and she was glad for that, because being rescued puts you in a position that doesn't leave room for becoming anything. It was an offer, with a refusal built into it. You could say no. You could take the room for a night and keep the dollar and walk away in the morning. She had not walked away. And the not walking away was her choice, made on her own terms, with her eyes open, in full understanding that she had no guarantee of anything except that the man asking was the kind of man who turned his hat in his hands when he was scared. What she had found, on the other side of that choice, was something she hadn't expected to find and couldn't have planned for. Not happiness as a destination, but as a condition. The condition of a life that had enough real things in it: work, partnership, belonging, the occasional knockdown argument about fence posts, rosemary in the kitchen garden, a daughter's letters, a young man growing up, neighbors who showed up, to feel inhabited rather than merely endured. She watched the sun go down behind the western hills every evening, the way she had since the first autumn. The light across the valley changed with the season, sharp and gold in October, pale and long in summer, thin and cold in February. And she watched all of it with the same attention, because the valley was worth watching, and she had learned, later than she should have, but in time, that paying attention to the things in front of you was not a small thing. It was, in fact, the whole thing. Some evenings, Clem sat on the porch steps and watched too, without knowing why. Walt Pruitt sometimes appeared in the yard at that hour, doing something practical that didn't strictly need doing at sunset, but being there. The ranch moved around her with its own life, its own needs and rhythms, and she moved with it. She was 63 when she arrived. She had $18 and a worn carpet bag and a dead sister's letter and the particular discipline of a woman who does not fall apart in public. She had been offered a question. She had said yes to it. And the yes had grown into something neither of them could have mapped on that station platform in October, something built out of survey maps and legal filings, and 2 a.m. coffee and hard winters, and a kitchen garden and the slow, imperfect, necessary work of learning to trust another person and to let yourself be known by them. Something built out of staying, which is a quieter act than arriving but takes everything you have. The sun went down. The valley held its color for a few minutes, amber, then rose, then the soft gray that comes before dark. A light came on in the bunkhouse. Somewhere on the south pasture, cattle moved. Evelyn Cross sat on the porch of the ranch that was hers and watched it all, and the evening came in around her like something familiar, and she